So let us begin. If you would please introduce yourselves. I'll call your name. If you'll give your name, your community, and we'll move right through it. Sabina Broshu.
Sabina Broshu, Williston, student member.
Kim.
Kim Gleason, Essex.
And Kathy.
Kathy LaVoy, Franklin County, Swanton.
Jenna.
Jenna O'Farrell, St. Johnsbury.
Oliver.
Oliver Olson, Londonderry.
Peter. Peter Phelps. Jennifer Samuelson.
Jennifer Samuelson, Winhall.
Dan French, are you there?
Yes, sir. Dan French, Secretary of Education.
Yeah, there you are. Okay, thank you. And I'm John Carroll, Chair of the Board from Norwich. Thank you all.
Angelita.
I'm sorry?
You forgot Angelita.
Did she come back? Oh, Angelita. Sorry.
Angelita Pena, Bristol, student representative.
There you are. Good. Nice to see you, Angelita. Thank you for reminding me.
Excuse me, John. I believe
yes.
that Bill Mathis is on as well.
Oh, wonderful. Bill Mathis, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
And would you just identify yourself, please?
Mathis Scotian.
Thank you, sir. Are there any amendments to the agenda? Very good. Let's go to item B, the consent agenda, which consists of approving the minutes of the 20 January meeting. Is there a motion, please?
I'll
So
move,
moved.
Kim.
It's been moved. Is there a second?
I'll second.
Okay. Who moved, please?
Kim. It
Kim.
sounded like a few of us.
It was moved by Kim, seconded by Oliver. Does anybody have any changes they need to propose? The chair has a small one, Suzanne. On page 6, I'm sorry, yeah, I think it is page 6. Yeah, page 6. At the top of the page, the sentence reads, spoke about 4 appeals filed by separate families in which the parents have applied for tuition support. The sentence that's concerning is, this request was denied by the local education agency. The proper expression should be the local school board. Top of page 6.
Okay.
With that change, are you ready for the question? All those in favor of adopting the minutes as proposed to be amended, please indicate by raising your hand. Angelita? I'm sorry, you can't vote, of course. Thank you. I think it's unanimous. Thank you, Suzanne. Are there board member announcements? Any board members who wish to make an announcement?
I'd like to make an announcement that I think you can see me for the first time in many months.
Peter, way to go. Thank God you asked somebody a younger generation to hook you up. Nice to see you.
Thank you.
Great to see you. Bill, we hope to see you.
I hope to see me too.
Yeah. So are there any student reports that we would like to hear?
Yes. I can start off and then transition into Angelita and both of us. But I think the first big important student news is that sports have started and we can play games. And that has been, for me, exciting because I'm one of those students who gets to play games.
Yes.
And I think I reflect the entire student body who plays sports when I say it has been amazing to be able to be on the ice or on the court and being able to compete again with our teammates.
I'll bet. That's great. Sabina, you and Angelita were working on a survey of student well-being / mental health.
Yes. Can you see my screen?
We do see it. Thank you.
Okay, so Anilita and I have just finalized the survey. Actually, we worked with a professor over at UVM who specializes in psychology. And so she had created a survey, and through the resources that she used basically to create this survey, she was pulling from other surveys that had been approved and peer reviewed. And so the questions had basically been chosen as very good questions to use in terms of getting information from students and people about their experiences with COVID. And so we kind of pulled from those questions. So a lot of these questions will reflect that, but a few of them obviously not as much in terms of how are you attending school? That's more of a general question. So that way we can see if kids who are fully remote versus hybrid, who's doing better in terms of mental health and well-being. So that is the first question. Then there is how much sleep do you get? And then how many days a week are you getting outside of your house? That is kind of really important for kids, because if you're stuck inside your house or in your room all day, you're not really getting it. It has such a huge effect on your mental health. And I've experienced that personally. If you're able to get out for a walk, you feel so much better. Then the next two questions are simply about, is there someone in your life, either an adult or a peer, who you feel comfortable talking to about your issues? Do you want to take these next few, Anulita? Can you see them?
I can't see your shared screen. I've been having problems with that. So if you want to, you can. It's better if you go over it.
Yeah, I'll have you explain the last question, because that was mainly you who did that, and you can do that. So then we have basically asking about, in the past month, how often you have felt stressed or nervous. This was actually one of the questions that we were pulling from the other surveys. These last few are. And so we were asking about that. How often have you struggled to concentrate on a task? And then we moved on to think about, kids are looking at screens so much more nowadays to connect with friends, to connect with teachers, and be able to do schoolwork. That has changed drastically, because before you go in person to school, you would be able to meet with your teachers in class or see your friends between periods or eat with them at lunch. And now all of a sudden I'm FaceTiming my friend to do our French work together, instead of, being able to sit with her in a free block to do it. So that obviously the amount of time that you are looking at a screen has a huge effect on your mental well-being, how tired you are, and things like that. And then these next two are, in the past month, how often have you felt you were unable to control your situation? And a lot of these questions are linked to ways of asking kids if they have felt symptoms of anxiety or depression without straight up asking them, because a lot of times it's hard to self-diagnose with something like that, but experiencing these small things kind of point to, well, you're experiencing a symptom of anxiety. Doesn't mean you have it. It just means that students are experiencing that. And then this next one is, how in the past month, how often have you had little interest or pleasure in doing things? This one correlates more to a symptom of depression. And then in the past month, how often have you felt worried that your loved one would become sick? Specifically referring to COVID, but in general as well. Again, more of an anxiety symptom. And then this last question here, I'll hand it over to Anilita.
Yeah, so like Sabina said, we were trying to ask questions that are more directed of symptoms of mental illnesses and things like that, without directly being like, okay, this is what you may have. And like she said, you can't really self-diagnose. But the last question, because we were asking a majority of these questions, I also wanted to see, good and bad habits, coping mechanisms that kids might have. Certain questions we can't ask because of liability, and that's just a line that we cannot cross as students and as school board. But we have some basic bad habits like nail biting, spending a lot of money at once, watching TV 24/7. And, perhaps these aren't major bad habits, but I know for a fact nail biting, I used to do that a lot when I was really stressed, and it's not healthy. It's not the greatest thing to do. And we're not going to come out and say good and bad habits, but I think it's good for us to know where people are on coping and how, as a community and a state, we can kind of be like, okay, these are what students are doing. What can we try and do to do that? But I guess as a general idea, I just thought it was a really good question to ask, to see where kids are currently, and just to kind of, I don't know, honestly, but I just thought it was a really good question to ask. So yeah, I see a question.
Is there a question, comment? Peter.
I have a question in regards to the change in schedule in terms of amount of time you'll be spending in school. Is that going to improve the situation, or is that happening? Are you spending more time actually in the school? Thank you.
That hasn't personally changed for me, and I highly doubt that it will by the end of the school year, simply because our schedule has been changed drastically from last year. So if I were to be going fully in person, or 4 days in person, I would be spending, I think it was somewhere around like over 2 hours in the same classroom with this teacher 4 days a week, which, like, I love her dearly, but at some point, like, it is nice to be able to sit at home and just do work. Because before, we would have a rotating schedule where I would see teachers every other day, but they split it up into a more condensed schedule. So you're taking your year-long classes in a semester. And so I simply think, just for logistics sake, it's going to be hard to move to a fully in-person schedule this school year. Obviously, come next school year, people are going to be relooking at the schedule and COVID numbers and everything. And I think that if we're able to go back to either fully in person or just more than we currently are, that will definitely help students in terms of getting back to where we were pre-COVID mental health wise.
Very good. Thank you. Jennifer Samuelson, you had a comment or a question?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think you guys have done a fantastic job. I appreciate the work that you all put into it, and I think you've asked some really, really good questions. I guess I had 3 questions that I wanted, a little more information on. One is, are the surveys anonymous? The second is, what schools are going to be receiving the questionnaire? And then the third one, I don't know if you can ask, but I'd be curious to know on that last question if self-medication is a option that you all thought about including. Thank you.
Yeah, I can address those, I guess, in reverse order. As Anulita said, there were some liability issues I was thinking about, because, answer your first question, it is completely anonymous. Like, the most specific we're getting here is what type of school are you attending, fully remote, hybrid, or fully in person? And we say that at the top of the survey, because I think a lot of these questions may be personal, and at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter that much to us what school these kids are coming from, what grade they're in, and things like that. And so I just wanted to provide them and principals with more comfort of having this sent out to their kids, because some principals may feel like, well, I don't want, the state to see that kids at my school are struggling with mental health, and then everyone's coming down on me about it. So yeah, we've made it completely anonymous. And because it's anonymous, if a student is saying, yes, I'm using hard drugs, you can't really, all of a sudden it's like, well, we should be able to help that student, because teachers are they have to report, they're mandated reporters. So if they hear something, and in a way, I feel like if we were to hear something that we're mandated to report, there's no way to trace it back. And I would personally hate to have a student be like, yes, I am, going and doing illegal activities. You don't know who I am, and you can't provide me with any support. So I think it's a great idea in sense of asking them, but at the same time, we wouldn't gain too much out of that besides just knowing that there are more kids out there, or there's fewer kids. And then in terms of getting it out, I was hoping you guys so generously offered some of you to send this out to your contacts. And I was also going to use the student network, and Dan French offered, and through Jane Nicholson, sending it to the BPA. So if we have all these people just kind of forwarding this link and letting principals know and people in the school community know that this survey is out there and we're looking to get student responses, I'm hoping to get this to as many high school students across the state as possible. Definitely trying to break our numbers from our last survey. So I can forward that link along to everyone, and it basically, it'll give people a link straight to the survey that you're looking at right now, and students can just fill it out from there.
Very good. Thank you both, Annalita and Sabina. Are there any other board reports? Oliver.
Yeah, sorry, just a question or suggestion, Sabina. I think this is a wonderful activity. I do want to throw a little bit of caution out there, and if you haven't already, suggest that Emily take a look at this. I'm just a little concerned about the nature of the information collected, and want to make sure we have adequate safeguards around the data once it's available. I'm thinking there's potentially some sensitive data here, and I want to make sure we don't run into any FERPA issues.
Yeah, definitely. I know Emily's going to be here for part of the meeting, so maybe if someone could just.
Dan, are you okay with that?
Yeah, I guess I'm sort of divided on it. I think I could see this being sponsored by 2 high school students who have no affiliation whatsoever, just on their own part are doing this information gathering. And therefore, to what extent people participated into liability and so forth is really limited. On the other hand, if the agency becomes more involved, it becomes more of a state-sponsored survey, which is not necessarily something we would condone without direct involvement and so forth. So it's cleaner, I think, just to keep it as something they're doing, consulting with someone on the outside, and just they're doing as part of their own sort of high school initiative to understand what's going on, and they're going to share their results with us.
Okay.
Very good. Good exchange. Thank you. So, Suzanne, we're coming up on time for public comment. Are there any, we know of one person who wishes to make a public comment. Are there others?
I am only aware of the one, Sean Marie Eller.
I'm on the line, please. This is Philip Eller from the Vermont Autism Task Force. If I could just make a quick comment.
All right, thank you. Good to know. Are there any other members of the public who wish to be heard at this time? How many outside calls do we have, Suzanne?
I would say 4.
Okay. I wonder if those folks would like to identify themselves. Imagine this was a meeting in the old days where we were all in the same room. We'd probably introduce ourselves. So we know that Sean Marie is there and Mr. Eller is there. Who else?
Probably me, Bill Mathis.
Oh, okay. All right.
Yes, I didn't count Bill.
Okay, there's 2 others anyway. Would you care to identify yourselves?
Good morning. This is Attorney Kim Doherty.
And where are you from, please?
I am monitoring the rule changes as a concerned person representing survivors of Kernhattan.
And your address in Vermont is?
I don't have an address in Vermont. This is a public hearing, and so I'm participating on behalf of concerned citizens in Vermont.
I see. Very good. Thank you. And would anybody else like to identify themselves? Very good. So let's begin. Sean Marie, 5 minutes, please.
Oh, sure. I don't think I need that much. I'm actually calling in to express my immense gratitude for the many years that Bill Mathis has served on the State Board of Education and shared his wisdom and his experience that impacted many students and his previous colleagues in the state, and also to Peter. Of course, I did sit on the board with both of them, but that doesn't negate my gratitude for their years of service. And that's my main reason for calling in. My second reason is just to clarify, and it will probably be clarified under H, J, and K, is with the rules being proposed, I notice on J there's actually a discuss and a vote. And I'm wondering on the others if there's going to be a time for public comment, or does that come after you guys vote on the changes? I'm just a little unclear, which I'm believing that at some point in the morning you'll make it clear on where the public comments come in for the rule changes.
Understandable question, and in my remarks to the board coming up soon, I hope to give kind of an overview of that, and from that, I think we'll be able to see better where the public comment process fits in.
Okay, thank you very much, John.
Thank you, Sean
And
Marie.
hello to everybody.
Thank you. Thank you for your nice comment for Bill and Peter. Mr. Eller, do you have something you'd wish to say?
Yes, just a quick message that the Vermont Autism Task Force is greatly appreciative of the work of the Rules Committee, and we highly support especially the proposal for rule changes for 2360. And I'll stay online for a little while to hear how your discussion goes. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you for that comment. Are there any other public comments? Hearing none, then we'll begin the chair's report, item E.
John, I just want to tell you that you were right on time, punctual for 9:25. A big applause for that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. It happens very rarely. It's quite noteworthy. Thank you. So there are three things I'd like to cover with you in my report. The first, and this I hope will help Sean Marie address Sean Marie's question, is to speak about the timeline, which I have shared with you all. It's actually, I regret it's quite a dense document, but we're attempting to track the work of four, count them, four separate committees or working groups who are bringing together a whole series of strands, if you will, that apply to three separate rules, that all of which are either very much in process or are about to become officially in process. And I just wanted to maybe review with you the sort of cover page of the timeline, which I really think all board members need to have a grasp of the rulemaking process. And it's a bit arcane, and some of you are fairly recent to the process, but let me just sort of outline very quickly. There's essentially four stages. When the board either perceives or is told by the General Assembly that there is a need for changes to rules or the creation of new rules, there's first a process where typically stakeholder groups and the agency work together to develop new proposals. That can take as long as 18 months. The work on 1300 and 2360 has definitely taken that. It can sometimes happen in only 2 or 3 months. The next stage is where the state board reviews these proposals and in many cases makes provision for public comment. And finally, the third stage is not the final stage, but the beginning of the official rulemaking process as defined by statute is when the board adopts a rule as its proposed rule. And then it goes into the rulemaking process, which means it's filed with the Interagency Committee on Administrative Rules, ICAR. When that happens, that is the official beginning of the APA rulemaking process. So everything that comes up to that is preamble. Some of it's quite informal, discussions among groups. But it comes to a point where the board says, okay, we've seen enough. We've got ourselves a proposed rule. We adopt this. And then with the assistance of the agency, it's filed with ICAR. And that begins the formal rulemaking process. So really, at this point, you're only at stage 3. One of the first things that happens in the formal rulemaking process is the board conducts public hearings. Even though we've heard from the public, as you know, we heard a lot of public input on 1300 and 2360, but we still went and had public hearings. When we're done with those public hearings on our proposed rule, we then develop the final rule. And that, for example, is exactly what Kim and her group have been doing on the 1300, 2360 rules, taking all the input and turning it into a board's final rule, which the board will then adopt as its final rule and submit that back into the APA process. And it goes then to what's called the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules, gets reviewed by them. Assuming there are no serious concerns or problems, it then gets filed with the Secretary of State, and 15 days later, it goes into effect, unless by statute it goes into effect at a different time. So it's a 4-stage process. It can take easily 2 years, and that's almost what we will have spent on 1300, 2360 before they're done, or it can happen in lesser time. Let me just clarify that we're working on 3 different rules. We're in stage 4, the nearly final stages of 1300 and 2360, the 2 special education rules. And we're in the preamble phase of, we'll call it probably in stage 1 and 2 of the 2220 rules. Those are the independent school rules. And there are 3 groups working on those. And so to Sean Marie's question, throughout the 1300 and 2360 rules, there was a ton of opportunity for public hearing and input. And there will be certainly in once we start the APA process, there'll certainly be public hearings on the 2220 rule changes as well. And those will be very important to the board. We take that really seriously and listen very closely, and then we'll make time to incorporate those public comments as needed into the final rule we propose. So that's the sequence, and just the 4 groups who are working on this, just to review for you, we will see them at H, J, K, and L. The group working on 2360, 1300, which is a committee of the board led by Kim Gleason, also has Jenna O'Farrell, Bill Mathis, and Angelita Pena, is one group. Second group is the advisory group, the census-based advisory group. You've met Megan Roy and Marilyn Mahaney. And then the third group is a working group consisting, I guess, chaired by Emily Simmons of the agency, and it includes representatives of the independent schools. And the fourth group is another committee of the state board, which is looking at Rule 2220 rules, but not as mandated by Act 173. And Oliver Olson chairs that. Kim Gleason and Jennifer Samuelson are members of that committee. We will hear from all 4 of those today. I'm going to move on just very quickly to legislation. Because this is the beginning of a biennium, there's a pretty steady stream of new legislation coming in. These are bills proposed. It would be fanciful to imagine that they all will become law or see even the light of day. Some will perhaps never even get off the wall, as they say. When a new bill comes in, it gets referred to an appropriate committee, and they make a little card for it and put it up on the wall. And only some of the bills get off the wall in the first year of the biennium. Some others get off in the second year. So even though these bills are introduced, it's not clear whether they'll be passed. One that should be of interest to us is H180, which would allow the dissolution of or withdrawal from a unified union school district. You remember the Halifax Reading presentation. Well, they were a group that had voluntarily entered into a union. This bill would also extend the right to withdraw to districts that had not voluntarily entered. They had been, the vernacular term is a forced merger. That isn't the term that the board or agency uses, but they were directed to merge by the state plan. Those districts are not, under present law, permitted to withdraw from their district, their union. But H-180 would permit that. H-106 is an interesting one about community schools. The idea is to, we've all talked about this and heard proposals about this kind of thing, where a school would become the locus for a whole bunch of needed community services. They'd be developed, in some cases, delivered on site at the school. Therapy services, healthcare services, a variety of services that children with disadvantages who are whose needs are not met by ordinary school structure would get assistance. H-214 is an interesting one. Would have us establish statewide criteria for student proficiency-based education. And then alternatively, another one, H-181, would make proficiency-based learning optional. By rule, back in, 2014, I guess, when the board created the entire PBL program, the rule said it is not optional, it's mandatory. This bill would give school districts the ability not to be structuring themselves in the proficiency-based model. There's a proposal that Dan would like, the creation of a single statewide school district, H-215. There's a proposal to prohibit school resource officers. There's another proposal to increase funding for school resource officers, sort of a counter bill. One that would be very challenging is a bill to require the state board to define what a religious school is and set out the standards under Chittenden for how a religious school can demonstrate that it is not using public tuition monies for religious education. And then a similar one is one about dual enrollment. Under the present law, a student is eligible for dual enrollment only if they are receiving public funding, it may not be the term, but that's the idea, for their high school education. So if the funding for that is coming from parents or some other way, that does not qualify, and therefore those students are denied access to the dual enrollment program. This bill would, I think, have the board redefine or simply change the language so that regardless of the source of the student's funding for high school, they would be eligible for dual enrollment. So those are some of the kind of interesting things out there. They're all still pretty early on in the process. And then finally, I'd like to move on to talk with you about the status of the board's proposal last year to reform the state board. And as I've outlined to you, the idea was to get the board better focused on big picture issues and get the board, I better be careful how I express this, to have the board less involved in micromanaging the agency. There are many, many times when we are called upon to approve something, take snow days, for example, And frankly, we bring no expertise or value added to that consideration. And the thought is that the agency is perfectly capable of handling that without benefit of the school board looking over its shoulder. And there's a whole lot of vestigial stuff in the law that requires that. It's just leftover stuff that I don't think most people would think was really need to be there. So we propose to clear that all up, in part to give ourselves more bandwidth to do things like we did a year ago in January, where we held a day-long meeting and listening session about proficiency-based learning, from which I think many people found useful. The other thing is that there are 31 rule sets. So you all know what these rules are like now. You've been up to your eyeballs in them. Some of them are really long and really complicated. I once added up the total number of pages, and it's multiple hundreds of pages of rules. Many of these rules have just been ignored for years. They're all ours. We are legally responsible for the adoption of these rules. But many of them, again, sort of like the micromanaging, they're about things that we either know nothing or bring very little expertise. One obvious one is, how long can school buses idle? Well, it's an important question, but frankly, the state board brings no expertise to that question. And so it's sort of silly that the board has the authority to write that rule. So there's quite a bunch of rules that I think we all agree ought to be in the domain of the agency. And so the bill that was developed by the Senate Committee on Education did a division of these rules and left with the board the rules that regulate or govern or shape what happens in schools, educational quality standards, assessment standards and process, independent school rules, and the approval of independent school rules, those kinds of things. And by agreement between the agency and this board, and a deal was brokered by the chair of the Senate Committee on Education, who went back and forth by telephone with the Secretary of Education and with me and said, I would like you to have these rules, but not those rules. And he essentially brokered a deal, which sort of divided the baby, and about 5 or 6, maybe 8 key rules stayed with the board, and all the rest, the other 23 or so, went to the agency. And this was memorialized in the Senate bill, S-166. So there's a list of these are the board's rules. And these really, what I think most of us consider to be essential to our, what the board does and what people need us to do. And let me just comment about it, that it's very clear that the board plays an instrumental role in bringing public input into the making of rules. We're very good at that, and we're very conscientious about it. If you just look back at 1323-60, frankly, if it were not for the board's involvement, those rules would have just not gotten the input and guidance from the public had the board not been involved. So ask almost any stakeholder, and they'll say it's helpful to have the board doing these rules because the board creates a forum in which we can get at the table with the agency and work things out. So S-166, with this division of the rules that the agency and we both kind of somewhat unwillingly agreed to, but we agreed to them because more was going to the agency than I cared for, but as far as the agency was concerned, they perhaps wanted more than they got. A classic deal, nobody gets everything they want. That went to the state Senate, and to my kind of amazement and delight, frankly, it was passed unanimously. And I say amazement because there were some people in the Senate, maybe about a third of them, who were very, very hostile in the last several years toward the state board. And with good reason, I won't go into all that, but they had very good reason to feel that the state board was vastly overstepping its authority. And there were several bills to abolish the state board, kind of punitively. And when that thing passed unanimously, I was just delighted and really gratified that we had built the case that this is a board that wants to mind its business properly, does not want to be overstepping any bounds, wants to limit its authority appropriately, and still wants to be a very, very vital player in the formation of education policy in Vermont. So that's where S166 got to. And then along comes the pandemic, and all further work on S166 stopped, and on literally 100 other bills. And so because that was the end of the biennium, you have to go back to square one. You know, in a biennium, anything that you work on in the first year carries over to the second year. But at the end of that biennium, which ended in January, the new biennium starts. And so we are talking with both House and Senate Education, who have both expressed eagerness to pick up with where 166 left off and move it forward in both houses. I'm really hopeful this can happen real soon, because I'm sort of running out of gas on keeping it moving. But it's I'm pretty optimistic. There seems to be genuine sentiment. One other little piece that's very gratifying: the Sunset Advisory Committee met in late 2019, and partly on the basis of urgings from the agency and others, and again, that sort of simmering resentment toward the board. Some of it had to do with Act 46. They were getting ready to abolish the board. And Peter, bless your heart, Peter, and I went to see them, and we explained to them the kind of reform we had in mind. This was in November of 2019. And they said, okay, if you will do a significant reform of the board, we'll stand back and won't push for abolition. Those people on in the House and Senate now are so impressed by S166 that they themselves are actively supporting the passage of this bill. And they're the people who were toying with the idea of abolishing the board. So again, I think we've come a long way. It's still very fragile. It's still very delicate. You never know who's going to try to sabotage what you're doing. But I'm hopeful about this. But we have a lot of work left to do. Comments or questions on anything I've said?
Mr. Chair?
Yes.
Yeah, I echo a lot of your observations, and want to thank you for your hard work, and Peter, your hard work moving S166 forward last year. I had the opportunity, I don't know if any of you saw John's testimony before the Senate Education Committee a few weeks ago, but I thought it was a really good sort of discussion, and there's several new members in both the House and Senate Education Committees. So it's the nature of the legislative process. If you don't get a bill across the finish line, you have to sort of not necessarily start from ground zero, but you're definitely starting at a little bit of a disadvantage in that you have to bring a lot of folks up to speed. But I personally think that 166 was a really good framework, and hope that we can get some momentum behind that again this year. So I think at this time it might be really helpful for the board to formally sort of renew its support for S166, at least conceptually, and to empower you as the chair to speak with the relevant committees of jurisdiction in the legislature to express the board's point of view. So I put a few words while you were chatting. I put a few words to paper here, and if it pleases the board, I'd like to offer a motion at this time. So the motion would be to authorize the chair and only the chair to speak on behalf of the State Board of Education before committees of the General Assembly regarding proposals to reform the State Board of Education, and to direct the chair to express support for the framework established in Senate Bill S-166 from the 2020 legislative session and oppose proposals that would substantially undermine the reform efforts that advanced in the Senate last year.
Thank you. Is there a second to the motion? And then we can have a discussion if you wish.
Second.
It's been moved by Oliver Olson, seconded by Peter Peltz. I would just comment that I think such an expression of your support of the, as Oliver says, the framework and structure and the thrust of 166 would be very helpful, because it's one of the first questions they ask me when I come in front of them, is they say, is your board behind this? And I need to be able to say yes, because they don't want to listen very long after that. So are there comments or questions about the motion at hand?
Yes.
Yes, Bill.
First, I'm just wondering why this is really necessary. In one sense, the authority that's conveyed in 166, the draft, is authority that is already held by the legislature. There isn't any usurping authority. They have the authority in the first place, and it just seems redundant. And Oliver, I know that you were expediting things, and I appreciate that, but it is such a momentous kind of change in one regard that we should be having more discussion at the board level rather than giving unilateral authority to make these kinds of changes. That's a little uncomfortable.
Thank you, Bill. Are there other comments?
I have my hand raised, John. Kim?
Oh, sorry, Kim. Yes, please.
I support the notion. I want to make sure you have the support and the opportunity to speak on behalf of the board regarding changes. I think I would be concerned that it be limiting to further negotiation or conversation in the way the second part of that motion read, and I don't have it in front of me, but it seems as though it pigeonholes directly into the current language versus allowing latitude in continuing to bring information back to our board for conversation as the bill progresses. So that is my concern with the motion as stated, but I don't have it in front of me, so I don't know for sure. Oliver, maybe you can let me know if I'm misunderstanding.
So I hear your point, and I was really careful as I put these words on paper that I refer to the framework for that very reason, Kim. I think it would be unrealistic to expect the bill to pass in its exact form because there are new members of the General Assembly, and we should anticipate other issues and considerations will come up, and there does need to be some allowance for that flexibility. But I think what I was trying to convey is that the board is supportive of the general principles that did pass in Senate Bill 166 last year, that we
hamstring John or others in further conversation around changes.
Well, we're only expressing a sentiment of the board. In no way can we hamstring the agency or the committees. They'll do as they please.
No, I mean, even you, though, John, I guess that's what. Can you read it again, Oliver? Because I'm just wondering, could we just stop after the first part?
Yeah, let me read it. So, so the motion is to authorize the chair and only the chair to speak on behalf of the State Board of Education before committees of the General Assembly regarding proposals to reform the State Board of Education. So that's the first part. So it's being really clear that we're empowering the chair to speak on behalf of the board on this topic. And the second clause is to direct the chair to express support for the framework established in Senate Bill 166 from the 2020 legislative session and to oppose proposals that would substantially undermine the reform efforts that advanced in the Senate last year. So I think the key words are framework. So it's a general principles, general framework, acknowledging that there are obviously details to be worked out, and provides the chair with that with some latitude and flexibility there. And then on the inverse is we want to really be clear that we would oppose anything that would substantially undermine the proposal in 166.
Good, thank you. Kathy, you had a comment or question?
Yes, I don't remember whether or not we made a similar motion for the previous years in which the chair and Peter as well, I think I heard, went before the General Assembly in some way. But I wonder why it is necessary. I wouldn't want it to express, I wouldn't want it to be read that we as a board thought it was necessary to make a statement to give the power to our chair and to say that this is what we represent, as opposed to the general process of us supporting the chair in feeling comfortable that he's going to represent the position of the full board, that if he needs to bring Peter with him or Kim with him for further testimony, that it's allowed. I just don't know why it's necessary is my concern.
I guess I would just say that authorizing the chair part is not so necessary. But I think stating the board's support for the framework of S166 is vital, because they will ask me, does your board support what S166 did? And I have to be able to say yes. And they might say, how do you know that? And the answer would be that you've passed a vote that says we support the framework as it is. That's not saying we are intolerant of any tinkering or changing, but the framework is what we support. And the framework is getting the board out of the micromanaging, having the board retain the essential rules, and giving the agency other rules that are much more appropriate for the agency, but not all the rules. That's the framework that we're working with.
To be clear, Mr. Chair, that I support that. It was.
Okay. So, Kathy, would it help if I perhaps restated the motion as to authorize the chair to express support for the framework established in Senate Bill 166 from the 2020 legislative session and to oppose proposals that would substantially undermine the reform efforts that advanced in the Senate last year?
That does make a difference for me, though subtle. It just says that we're giving we're giving approval of what our chair will represent, and that this is what we feel is substantial.
Great. Are you ready for the question?
No, I have another comment.
John, there's a few hands.
Okay, thank you. Who's that, Bill?
Yeah.
Bill and then Kim.
No, Jenna's hand is up.
Oh, sorry, Jenna. Yep.
I'm not sure if you can see it in participants, John. But Jenna's hand, and then I have another question.
Thank you. Okay, here, Bill, and then Jenna.
Okay. I think that it needs to be more specific in the sense is that giving unilateral authority to anyone over something as open-ended as, quote, framework, unquote, is a little bit much, it strikes me, and doesn't have sufficient controls within itself. Can we be more specific exactly what these authorities are that we would be delegating? Framework seems like a wide open door.
I'm really only think we're talking about is saying that the board supports the framework. We're not talking about delegating authorities.
Well,
I think you're telling me that I can represent to the legislature that you support this framework. And
it's my question.
Yeah. So
unless we're excited about the framework can be pretty elastic.
Well, the framework is exactly what the bill as framed describes.
Which consists of?
Well, have you read the 66 pages of the bill? I mean, you have to roll up your sleeves and look at this stuff, and it's very, very specific about which rules will stay with the board and which will go with the agency. It's very specific about what micromanaging we will no longer do. And that language has been out there now for the better part of a year. It was passed. It was presented to the Senate in March. It was approved as written in March. So it's been around for 10 months. And all we're saying is, are you behind this or not? Jenna?
Well, I don't know what I'd be behind or not. That's my question.
Well, all you have to do is read the bill, and it tells you what we're talking about. Jenna? Can't hear you, Jenna.
I know I didn't talk yet. So I think Oliver's response to Kathy cleared up a couple of points that I can move forward with. Beyond supporting the framework, the second part of that was around opposition. And I'm wondering, does giving the chair the autonomy to oppose bills that are in conflict with the framework, does that language need to be more expansive, that sole responsibility doesn't rely on the chair, that there'd be some communication for bills that are in opposition to 166 coming back to the board for discussion? And I don't know if legislators would be looking for something that feels like there's some involvement, because moving forward, if the board agrees that something is in opposition, then the chair or their designee would be the person. I don't know if that language needs to be that way or not. I just raise a question.
So Jen, if I could respond to that, having a few of us, Peter, John and I have all served in the legislature. And one of the challenges is that, when you're in the legislature, when you're sitting in one of these committees and you're asking somebody to respond to something, it's often in real time, and there's really no time to go back to a full board for discussion. And that's one of the challenges that any board representative has when they are presenting something before the legislature. The more practical challenge is that our next meeting won't be until after crossover, which is the deadline for when bills need to pass the respective bodies in the General Assembly. So if John is pressed for a response on a particular proposal in the Senate or House Education Committee, or any other committee for that matter, between now and our next meeting, he won't have the opportunity to come before us as a board and seek our comment and response before that crossover deadline.
Thank you, Oliver. It has a little bit more urgency to it.
Kim, yes.
Yes, I continue to feel, and I think it is echoing Jenna's concern and referencing my initial one. I am more comfortable with leaving it with supporting the framework as opposed to opposition to that which might change it, because I think that there is a possibility that there would be conversation that might change some of it in a way that would be productive and agreeable. I will say, having been through the rules process and working hard to become a quasi-knowledgeable person on special ed rules, which is highly regulated, it is challenging to understand the value we added in that is in the convening and the managing the collaboration, which ultimately happened. And I think that there are many such rules and circumstances that I think is worth considering if there were to be suggested changes, whether or not we continue to be the most efficient, effective, valuable contributor in that work. So I know we had a finite list of which rules were ours and which rules were theirs. I think conceptually, the reasons described in the piece that John shared with us and in his testimony absolutely is the case. But I think that there can be conversation and arguments to be made about why diverting from that finite list of rules may make sense. So I am fully supportive of the first part of the new version, which gets rid of giving him full authority, but, says giving John the opportunity to know he has the support of the board for the framework. And I would do period, full stop, and not constrain him to navigating additional information and considering things differently. And I would hope that there are ways to keep our board informed between meetings. We certainly can't be doing replies to all, but we could expect there to be legislative updates in between. And I think that isn't in conflict.
Thank you, Kim.
Can I just quick? I think we're a bit in the weeds right now. I think what's really important is that the standing and how the board is received at the legislative level is what's at issue here. The board has not been well received in the past, and I think we're really trying to increase our situation, our hard work, and our status. And I think it's working, but we still got a ways to go. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I would love to move this question if you're ready for the question. Is Oliver, do you want to make any adjustments in your language to reflect the tone here or not?
Yeah, so and I'll take it as a friendly amendment to per Kathy's suggestion. I'm going to reduce this down to authorizing the chair to express support for the framework established in Senate Bill 166 from the 2020 legislative session and to oppose proposals that would substantially undermine the reform efforts that advanced in the Senate last year. So unless there's objection, I'll sort of present that as a friendly amendment. And I just want to briefly respond to Kim's point, and I think the word substantially really gets at the words framework and substantially provide the chair with some flexibility, and I think your points are all very valid, Kim. And I think if those kinds of conversations came up, that wouldn't be in conflict with the language here. Where this would address a situation, for example, where if somebody were to introduce a bill that proposed to abolish the state board or to essentially eliminate nearly all of its authority in some way, this would empower the chair to sort of speak on behalf of the board and clearly state that the board would be opposed to something that drastic. So hopefully that helps.
So thank you for that. Are you ready for the question?
John, I see Jen Samuelson's hand.
Oh. I'm sorry?
Well, I was just going to, thank you. Thanks, Kim.
Sorry, I was just going to say hands very well. Oh, there we are. Thank you. Sorry. Yeah.
So I was just going to say, as I'm sort of conceptually understanding all of this, I mean, when the biennium ended, the bill died, so we're kind of back at 0%. And if passage is 100%, the way I sort of envision what Oliver's motion is trying to do is to say, we don't have to go back to 0%. We had really good momentum. We had good support. And, maybe this puts us back at 80%. I'm just picking a number out of a hat. But, conceptually, we're almost there, understanding that there's probably going to be some changes that would necessarily come out of a new biennium, but we are not back at 0% or 30%, this just kind of scoots us forward and truncates a lot of the work that the legislature might otherwise have to do to get us to 100%.
I think that's a helpful analogy. Thank you. Are you ready for the question? Suzanne, would you call the roll, please?
Yes, I will. Sabina Brochu.
Aye.
Kim Gleason.
Kim?
I think she's frozen.
Okay, I'll come back. Kathy Lavoie.
Aye.
William Mathis.
Nay.
Was that a nay or a yay?
Nay, no.
Okay. Oliver Olson.
Affirmative.
Peter Peltz.
Aye.
Jennifer Samuelson.
Aye.
Jenna O'Farrell.
Aye.
Kim Gleason.
She might be trying to get back in. She disappeared.
Any sign of her, Suzanne?
I do not see her at the moment.
Too bad. Well, I'm very mindful of the time here. I guess the ayes appear to have it. The ayes clearly do have it. So we will regard the bill as the proposal as approved. Yes, you see, we've been talking about the legislature. We will regard the bill as the proposal as endorsed by the board. Thank you for that. And if Kim comes back, and we'll give her an opportunity to indicate her concurrence or her opposition, certainly, so she can be on the record about this. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, we've eaten into your time, and I apologize, but I want you to take whatever time you feel is necessary for your two topics.
Well, good morning. What I'd like to do is, provide some general, really quick updates on the COVID response, and then give you some time to ask me some questions about that. I found that to be a useful construct for me because we're moving very quickly on these items, and it's a month between our meetings, and I realize you might have specific questions, and it's not something I would generally cover in a brief summary. But from a COVID perspective, conditions, we have made it through the holiday period since our last meeting fairly well. We are seeing conditions improve pretty dramatically, actually, now across the country and the region. Not so much in Vermont. The case counts, transmission rates are coming down, but rather slowly. Of course, we weren't at the high that we saw before. Our schools continue to operate.
Dan, we've lost you.
10 cases of COVID a day in schools. A lot of work goes into managing that, but that continues to go very well. Big part of what we're focusing on now is sort of pointing the system for the next phase of the response, which we're calling recovery, in anticipation of conditions improving this spring with the warmer weather and the advent of more vaccine. So what I mean by recovery right now is the work we can do to mitigate the impact of the pandemic on students from an educational perspective, and that includes all that's implied from an educational perspective, feeding kids, their social emotional well-being, and so forth. We are going to require school districts to have a recovery team at the district level and to appoint a recovery coordinator. And the first phase of that work, which will probably start to take shape after April 1st, will be to assess their district's conditions in 3 domains. The first one being mental health, emotional well-being, so forth. Second domain, we're calling re-engagement to deal with the truancy issue. And the third domain, academic success. So we'll point districts into sort of a triage phase, if you will, initially to begin to assess their conditions, and we'll be wrapping supports around them, including integrating our supports with other agencies. And then the second phase will be to have districts actually create plans based on their needs, and we'll move forward into an implementation phase, hopefully prior to summer, and particularly so districts can leverage additional federal dollars that'll be coming down, and also to leverage the summer activities that they typically would. So that's sort of the broad brush narrative of where we're at with COVID. Why don't I pause there if you have any specific questions? We have another agenda item which pertains to calendar waivers, but I'll pause there to take any questions you might have.
Any questions for the Secretary?
Peter here, I have a quick question. There's a number of students that are significantly behind. Some statistics show that they're a year behind in terms of their schooling. How is that going to be addressed for those that haven't kept up? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, that's the point of doing the assessment phase, but I would say it's not clear to us to what extent there has been quote unquote learning loss. I think nationally we're accepting that phrase is inadequate, perhaps. We had, for example, NWA MAP testing that was done nationally. Typically about 40 million students a year take that assessment. There was far less participation in it this fall, but what it showed is that actually students were holding their own in in literacy, but there was a decline about 10% in math skills. So it's not clear yet to what extent we have learning loss and at what grade levels we have learning loss. So that's the point of sort of doing that initial assessment, I think, as the first part of a recovery activity.
Any other questions for the Secretary?
Oh, I do. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand. So, Secretary, when you say learning loss, are you thinking that that's kids had skills and they lost skills, or they just didn't progress in the trajectory that they were progressing at prior to the pandemic?
Yeah, I was just that's not a term I want to utilize for our recovery. I think we're focusing on, to what extent students have been impacted negatively from an academic perspective would be one of the three domains. But our initial approach on this will be asking districts to do that assessment internally in their own districts and letting them sort of use some of the tools that they have. Many have benchmark assessments. Others will just rely to a certain extent on their professional expertise of their teaching staff. For example, in high schools, how many failures have we had? Where are students in progressing through the normal content? At the elementary level, it would look very different because the instruction there is often organized around classes as opposed to courses. So it varies. The point is, I think we're not really sure yet to what extent folks or students have been negatively impacted from an academics perspective, and it will vary from district to district. We need to begin to do that assessment as part of our recovery work. So that's really my main point, is that we need to do that assessment. And I would say, to do that assessment does require more in-person contact than we currently have. So that's why a focus on in-person will become increasingly important.
Thank you, Jen. Any other questions?
Yes, please, John. It's Kim. And I apologize, our internet went down, so I'm going to leave the camera off while I'm connected to my cell phone to get in. But the question, or I guess comment and then a question, commenting to maybe again to align in Jenna's line of question, the falling behind leaves me feeling like falling behind what the entire nation and world are really experiencing these challenges. And so it may in fact be that students are not progressing at the same pace they would have through content ordinarily, but and there may in fact be inequitable distribution of how students have been able to keep up with or not the content. But I think it's just cautioning that we consider different language. Falling behind when the entire world is experiencing this is a little triggering for me as I hear that terminology. And then secondly, I think, Dan, a question to more in-person instruction. I think many of our Vermont schools have been in 4 or 5 days since late in the fall in our pre-K 5. But middle school and high school space constraints, and I think it was that delineation between, I forget what ages, 3 feet seemed adequate versus 6 feet. And I think that age break, at least in our district and some of the larger districts in Chittenden County, had us not able to accommodate the space needed for kids over that age that put us in the middle high school group. So there's more of that hybrid happening. And I'm just wondering, while there's thought to change the guidance, is that likely to change along the lines of safe considerations?
I'm sorry. I should have mentioned the CDC put out new guidance on Friday for schools. If you're following that conversation, more or less reaffirmed the importance of 6 feet. As Kim observed, we've been at 3 feet for students in grades K through 6 for basically since November, and that's worked very well for us. And we have data that shows that's been working very well, and the students are safe and so forth. The point I'd make on how our guidance would change, it's not the guidance is really dependent on an analysis of the conditions, the transmission rates, and so forth in the community. As we see time and time again, that there's a direct relationship between the amount of transmission in the community and the impact on the school. So yes, we are establishing, I think, a goal for more in person because of the work that we need to do to begin to mitigate the impact from an educational perspective on students. But it's all predicated on safety and safe conditions. So our guidance will not evolve unless the conditions allow it to evolve. So we're hopeful in anticipation that conditions will improve, particularly as we get into the warmer weather and vaccination starts to make more of an impact on the conditions, that we will be adjusting our guidance at some point accordingly. But it's the conditions that drive the guidance. And I thought that was, we sort of take that for granted, I think, in Vermont, but it's a nice point that was made in the CDC guidance that you really need to, bring down the rate of transmission in your community in order to operate schools safely. The two are, one becomes before the other, but the two are very interdependent. And to our credit as a state, over the summer, we were able to bring our transmission rates down very low, which enabled us to have a very successful reopening in the fall. But the situation we're in now, where we've sort of gotten more accustomed to elevated case rates. We're routinely, the last couple of days, I understand we were down in the 50s. But we've had, routinely in the last week or so, 100, and we've gotten used to that, but that's far higher than we were in October. So, before we could contemplate any change in distancing requirement, whether we have a goal or not of more in person, it will be predicated on first making the conditions more safe.
Thank you, Dan. Let us move on, if you're prepared to do so, to the next item on the agenda, which Dan will speak to. Item G, school calendar waiver request. I don't happen to have the copy of that motion in front of me. Does anybody? Oliver, I see you do.
Yeah, it was emailed. It was emailed to us.
Yeah, I know. Would you make the motion, please?
Yeah, certainly. So I'm going to offer the motion, but I actually have some suggested changes. So I move that the State Board of Education renew its authorization for the Secretary to, on the board's behalf, consider and grant waivers of up to 10 school days for unanticipated closures under 16 VSA 1071C in the 2020-2021 school year.
Thank you, Oliver. Is there a second to the motion?
I'll second, Kim.
Kim Gleason has seconded the motion. Thank you, Kim. So, Oliver, let us have discussion. First, let's invite the Secretary to offer his comments, please.
Yeah, thank you for considering this. As you're aware, I think John mentioned the snow day phenomena in his previous comments. Typically, the board would entertain waivers related to school calendar starting in February, and it's usually directly related to weather, but it could be for other reasons. As we saw last spring, the COVID emergency brings a whole nother element to this conversation, and the board, to order to address those in expedient fashion, authorized me to take those on directly last spring. Similarly, right now we have a handful of waivers that have emerged. I'd say about 5 already that are directly, I would attribute to the COVID response. So that pattern is emerging. So I'd suggest that the board might find it useful to grant me a similar waiver authority for this spring as well.
Oliver.
So I'm very supportive of this. I think it makes a lot of sense in the world. I was only going to suggest, because I think the reality is that COVID will clearly be with us at least through the fall and perhaps into next winter to some extent. I was going to suggest that we, rather than restrict it to the 2020-2021 school year, we might sort of tie it to the continuing existence of the governor's emergency declaration, something to that effect. So for as long as we're in a state of emergency, the secretary would have this authority.
Before I invite a second to your amendment, Mr. Secretary, do you wish to comment on that?
I think the motion that we shared with you would accomplish my needs for the spring. To Oliver's point about extending that, it's certainly not clear to me to how long the emergency would continue to exist. The governor's been extending that on a month-by-month basis. And I think the way the regulation functions, the board doesn't really begin to become involved until February of the ensuing year. The idea, operationally, I think the point is to give districts some sort of direction on trying to accommodate changes in their schedule prior to February. It's only with the spring coming that they realize they're running out of time, so they have the ability to adjust their vacation schedules and so forth. So it's not clear to me, I guess, to what extent the change is necessary through the fall, because typically waivers are not entertained through the fall. And it's certainly, I think next spring, I'm hopeful that the state of emergency wouldn't exist and we'd be back to normal in terms of processing these waiver requests.
So I didn't actually offer that as a formal amendment, but I think that explanation helps. So I'll withdraw the suggestion.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I just have a quick question in regards to how learning loss is translated into days. Can you help us on that?
Yeah, I think perhaps what you're thinking about is attendance days, session days. That's really the direct connection. I don't think there's ever been a connection between student outcomes and requirements for time on instruction, so to speak, in Vermont. So the question would be, do we have session days, meaning the minimum of 175? That's really the waiver that we're looking at. If districts were unable to offer instruction remotely or otherwise, and we've qualified what counts as a remote attendance day. So that's perhaps, Peter, your question is about to what extent was it a session day or not? And that's really the extent of the waiver. There's no direct connection to student outcomes.
Yeah, if I may, it's just that the way the schedule is kind of is very different in terms of whether it's 1 or 2 days a week or whatever. It's a different way of I don't know how you calculate.
Yeah, we have guidance that actually our current regulatory framework, we didn't have to do much on this last spring, that we came up with a way to take attendance essentially on remote learning days. So those have emerged as contractual days under the minimum 175. And, I mentioned the word contract. I think that's an important element here. It's not, once again, it's not tied to learning loss. It's tied to job, contracting days, and teachers are typically contracted, for at least the minimum in their master agreements, but certainly could have more. But that's all been accommodated. What I think we're talking about for a waiver request would be above and beyond that, anomalies where they did not have school. In particular, I think there's a pattern, or will be a pattern, around the executive order that delayed the start of school. So there were, if you remember that, we delayed school until after Labor Day to sort of bring everyone together. Some districts had already started earlier in that. So there's some acknowledgement that there needs to be a reconciliation from a contract standpoint about what happened prior to that executive order. So those are some of the issues that are on the table that need to be evaluated.
Very good. Are there further questions?
Just a comment, if
yes,
I might,
Bill.
is converting learning losses into learning days and so forth is there's not any consensus on how to do that. It's just an impossible task to come up with. I think the bigger question is not how we count days now, but at the end is how do we measure exactly what our learning loss is, where it is, how it is going to be treated, and I don't have a clue as to how that's going to be able to work out because of its complexity. And I was wondering, Dan, if you had given that more thought.
Yeah, and I guess that's when Peter uses the phrase learning loss, it's more associated with that sort of triage or recovery work that I was speaking to earlier. This issue to me is not directly related to that. This is really about implementing regulation and addressing some of the contractual anomalies that have occurred as a result of the emergency. It has nothing really to do with the recovery piece, other than to say, to Bill's point, firstly, districts will do that assessment about what their academic conditions are. And I would also say in conjunction with the other two domains. So we're not necessarily elevating, part of the issue with learning loss is it sort of doesn't put enough emphasis, in my view, on the social emotional impact of the emergency and certainly the engagement aspects. So we want districts to do that assessment in all three of the domains. The next step in terms of implementation will no doubt have contractual implications. They will be, and we have significant federal resources coming online to help districts pay for these things, but they will no doubt be going to their teachers and saying, okay, what would summer school look like, for example? And that requires, I would say, negotiation, if you will, but at least a contractual arrangement with teachers on a per diem basis to provide services through the summer and so forth. So all those kinds of conversations are coming. They're not necessarily directly connected to this waiver request, which is really, I think, mostly about the beginning, how school opened around the executive order, and then certainly how snow days have played out. We are getting a lot of snow, coincidentally, so which is not a bad thing.
Thank you. I'm happy to have more conversation. Please confine your remarks to the narrow scope that Dan has just described. Kim, yes.
Yeah, I was just going to offer an example that might help. Our school district knew by noon on Monday that we were going to not be in person for instruction on Tuesday due to the weather, and made Tuesday a fully remote day. So there's, in the COVID win category, the opportunity to pivot. And so that won't count as a snow day. It was an instructional day. We've previously had a snow day that was in fact a snow day. It was determined late in the day, and that's sort of the parameters being put around it. So not for purposes of this conversation, but I think the bigger, longer, interesting conversation is around what student instruction time looks like and how that's executed post-COVID. So thank you. I just thought that example might help people see what we're talking about.
Thank you, Kim. Suzanne, housekeeping question for you. Did we get a second on Oliver's motion?
Let me check.
Jennifer Kim had seconded it.
I don't think you did.
Yes, Jennifer, would you like to second the motion?
I'll second.
It's been seconded. It's been moved by Oliver Olson and seconded by Jennifer Samuelson to adopt the motion as proposed by the Secretary of Education. Are you ready for the question? Let's do it by roll, please. Suzanne, please call the roll.
Yes, Sabina Brochu.
I think Sabina had
She might be at class, correct. Kim Gleason.
Yes.
Kathy Lavoie.
Yes.
William Mathis.
Yes.
Oliver Olson.
Yes.
Peter Peltz.
Aye.
Jennifer Samuelson.
Aye.
Jenna O'Farrell.
Yes.
Chair Carroll, will you be voting?
Yes, in the affirmative.
Thank you.
Just one, thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. God bless, Godspeed. One housekeeping detail on the Kim Gleason, when your bandwidth collapsed, we were unable to hear if you cast a vote on the motion that was discussed regarding S-166. So could you tell us how you would vote on that motion?
Yes, subsequent to our conversation, I'm comfortable voting in the affirmative on that.
You're voting in the, thank you. The vote then is, I think, 7-1, if I recall correctly. The chair did not vote. Thank you, board. We're running, mea culpa, we're running behind schedule. It's 10:35 or thereabouts. Let's take 5 and get back here at 10:40 if possible, and we'll get going again. Thanks so much. And which, of course, is item L. Oliver, are you able to do that now?
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I'm actually here. Like, I've got it going. I think the video might work.
Okay.
So
right.
I get kicked off. If I get kicked off again, I will go back to no video. But I'm going to try.
Okay.
It went down for its entirety in our household. So.
Okay. So let me just introduce what you're doing. What, as I outlined to you earlier, Kim has chaired a committee consisting of 3 board members working, I think, very closely with Emily Simmons, and they have just brought together a whole lot of public comment from stakeholders, from individual parents, and so on, even from students themselves, and I think have really come to a consensus agreement. And as Kim said, this function of the committee of convening and creating a forum and a process and an imperative to get to consensus has really worked. And I commend Kim and all 3 members of the committee, and Emily as well, for the hard and effective work that's gone into this. So Kim, lay it on us.
Great, thank you. I just have to start with tremendous gratitude myself for our committee, for Emily especially, and Megan and Marilyn, Megan Roy and Marilyn Mahusky, and all the stakeholders that took the time to weigh in and share with us. We took our charge to take a look at 3 specific areas: adverse effect, parental consent, and MTSS. And I think sort of overlaid that with our goals that we would be aligning our language more closely with federal language, that we would look to improve practice and consistency, and really try and bring those things together in some sense of consensus that would allow for all those things to happen. And we had amazing partners in this work. We have consensus language to address all 3 areas. I will just say, and I think when we get to it, Emily will point to it, the MTSS language was already referenced in the previous draft of the rules that we were all working from. And anything beyond that reference with respect to MTSS may be considered as a separate rule. And that, so to put MTSS into context, that is taken care of by the existing language that was in the draft version of the rules. And beyond that scope, in reference to, with respect to 173 and special ed, MTSS is not a special ed construct. It is an education construct. And so if there is to be a rule around MTSS, it will come outside of special education rules. So the other 2 areas, broadly, we changed how adverse effect is being approached, and in some ways under some categories, and I'm going to, in a minute, let Emily walk us through those. And then with respect to parental consent, we've created a construct that brings more parental voice into it more formally, but does not change substantially the requirements around parental consent. So I am going to, I know you received several documents under this category, but I think that which is most helpful is the 9 pages, so that of this section of the rules that allows us to see these changes in context. So you do have a side-by-side, but I think more beneficial is walking through the sections of the rules that address these changes so that we can see them in context.
Is that
and
item
unless any,
H1? Is that labeled H1?
I think it is, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Let's go with that.
Terrific, thank you. And I'm going to ask Emily to walk us through it. And then any questions, I think we can probably handle as we go along. And any comments or feedback as well from our committee, please jump in. Thanks, Emily.
Emily, thank you.
Okay, Emily's going to screen share and I'll look for hands. How's that, Emily?
Okay.
Thank you. Kim and I are getting really used to this format. We're a good team. Okay, I'm sharing my screen, which is Kim referenced is item H1. If you refer to the summary of rulemaking documents, we're starting at the first H1. This is a 10-page document that excerpts the rules that the committee has amended. You also have in document H2 the full text of 2360 with each of these identical amendments made on the page numbers that are indicated on your summary document. Right. So the first instance of the committee's suggested amendment is really, I think the state board saw this last month, is really a change to align to the federal rules, which is to not require a finding of adverse effect for two disability categories. Those are deafblindness and specific learning disability. Then on the same page, the rule defining adverse effect appears. The committee's suggested changes are in these 3 paragraphs that appear here on the screen. The language is consensus language. We reached consensus between the agency, the representative of Vermont Special Education, Megan Roy's group, and Marilyn Mahusky's group, the Disability Law Project. So we worked very hard on hitting the right balance in this language. To give you context about what this change is from a very high level, the rule would shift from being a definition of adverse effect that is mathematical, that is objective, that is perhaps only driven by data, to one that is more reliant on the opinions of the experts who work with the students and the more general findings that those experts might take related to the student's educational performance. So a lot of emphasis in these 3 paragraphs is on how do we know what adverse effect is? It's a sweet spot between, you see the language there, more than a minor or transient hindrance, but we also included language that the impact need not be substantial, significant, or marked. Discussions that we had centered around, we're gonna trust special education teachers and administrators to know their students and to fit their students' abilities and needs within this language and make a judgment. An important aspect of an adverse effect finding that's not changing, but it is maybe being highlighted in this new language, is driving everything back to what impact is the student's disability having on their performance in the basic skills areas. So the next change that you're going to see is related to what are the identified basic skills areas. That appears after all the strike through of the old definition. That language starts to appear on page 3. So it's appearing on the screen now. This next change is adding a new basic skill, which is that of functional skills. I think board members will remember a public comment that related to a request to add functional skills to the basic skills areas. So we've done that. And then the definition that appears on the bottom of your screen right now is not new language. It's a definition of functional skills that's used in another area of the rules and is copied here for ease of reference, but is not a new definition. So those are the acquisition of essential and critical thinking skills, things like personal skills, social skills, employment skills that prepare students for other lifelong opportunities. Okay, so that's the first rule that appears in the committee's work. Moving on, this is a callback to the first change that you saw, which is eliminating the finding of adverse effect related to specific learning disabilities. That change appears here in numbered item 1, I'm indicating it with my cursor. It's just a statement that we've added. The eligibility does not require to include a finding of adverse effect. The other change the committee is suggesting in the evaluation rule for specific learning disability relates to another alignment to federal rules, which is that the federal rules have shifted and no longer allow a discrepancy model as a method for identifying specific learning disability, but requires the state to give districts the option, or LEAs the option, to use 2 types of research-based methods for identifying students. That's the language here. Whether the student responds to scientific research-based intervention, or the LEA may use a model based on other alternative research-based procedures. This is the federal language that's quoted here in the text. So moving right along, we're finished with page 4. The rest of the rule appears there for everyone's reference so that you have the context. But the next point of the committee's discussion doesn't appear again until page 6, which is the MTSS rule that Kim just referenced. The note here indicates that this is not language the committee is suggesting you change. We're pointing out that relevant language existed in the rules as filed with ICAR, and the committee decided that this was sufficient as far as the special education rules go to address the concerns. So just a copy here so that you can see there is MTSS language about, of course, not delaying or denying evaluation because the district also is using MTSS for the student. Then the final change is in the rule about what is required to go in student IEPs in Vermont. So you'll want to go down to the middle of the rule on page 7. Consensus language between the 3 groups that I indicated. We all felt that the idea came from the Disability Law Project. I should indicate this change here about the data that describes the goals and objectives the student will be working toward and how goals progress will be assessed. Everyone felt that this was more clear language that reflects practice and requires everyone to update practice around the use of really clear data. So then finally, the parent input change is the very last bit of the rule about IEP content. It appears, let's check the page number. It appears on page 10. And it's a new requirement that the IEP contain a section where parents can provide written comment regarding the IEP, and that they have 10 days to provide that written comment, get it back to the supervisory union, that the content, the text of the parent's comment will be included in the IEP. The LEA may opt to schedule a meeting to further discuss that content, but is not required to do so. It is an option that the parent input live with the IEP and move forward with the student as long as they have the IEP. It's there for anyone who works with the student to access, but is not a new entitlement that we would be concerned would conflict with IDEA, for example. It's not a new entitlement to have the services or the goals of the IEP changed. It's just a final opportunity for the parent to give their input.
Kathy, is it okay, John, if I'm looking at the hands, is it okay if I invite Kathy?
Yes, I'll be happy to do that. So
okay, you can see them. I wasn't sure.
You ready for some questions?
Yes.
Yes, good. Then Kathy, I see your hand up.
Yes. The only issue that I had was on this last page about the parent input, and I'm rereading it quickly, but I didn't know that it didn't seem to be clear that information would necessarily stay in the IEP. And I think the reason that I came to that is because the last sentence talks about the LEA may, but is not required to schedule a meeting to discuss with the parents' concerns. So I just It seems like the language is a little bit weak in guaranteeing that there'll be acknowledgement and modification to the IEP based upon this input. And I might be wrong. I may just be reading it too literally, I guess.
So I'm going to comment and then invite Emily as well. So it is not required that that feedback result in a modification to the plan, but it is the expectation that that feedback be captured and filed. There was a discussion initially, and there was concern initially from the special ed practitioners that it would be an endless loop, that you'd be going back and forth and you would never be able to execute the plan. And that in having this valuable feedback be captured in writing, if parents should choose, that information is there for those that work with the student to see for future plans. But there's no requirement that the actual plan for the student be changed. What I am pausing a little bit on myself was a hesitation, and we weren't sure exactly what to do about it in the words, that it should be clear that this version of the form that is put in the permanent record include that parent input. And is that what you were wondering, Kathy? Because that, I couldn't tell if that was obvious for practitioners and just not obvious for me. So we kind of let that go. But if that's raising a question, I don't know, Emily, if you have any thoughts on it. She and I were talking about this, but neither of us are practitioners.
Yeah, it was the only thing in the whole document that raised a flag for me, was that it wasn't clear that whatever the parent said would be in some form, even though you may not change the IEP, in some form will be in the records. And I understand the continuous loop, but
yeah. But to Kathy's point, there is no clear requirement here that the IEP incorporate the parents' comments.
Yeah, I think that we might need to make it.
You're thinking it should, and if it should, then it ought to say that, shouldn't it?
Well, I think it's the IEP not incorporating the comments, is that the comments need to be filed with the IEP.
Understood.
So that the comments need to be in the same
if you will,
the same location.
Appended to the IEP. Yes. Understood. Yeah. Right. But it would be, there's that concern, and the other one is the language. I'm not sure what the intent is. The parent shall be provided up to 10 days. Does that mean that the parent can be provided 5 days?
No, it means, well, I see your point.
Yep, that's right.
Maybe we need to say
shall be provided 10 days. And if they fail in 10 days, then they've missed the boat. If they get it in 3 days, great.
That makes sense to me. Provided 10 days to complete. Yep. I see Jen and Megan, and I'm wondering if Megan is, I don't want to leapfrog Jen or tell the chair what to do, but I know Megan was with us in these conversations and is our practitioner extraordinaire. John, is it okay if Megan?
Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, of course, Megan. Pardon me. Yes.
Thanks. It is because my comment is related to that question of are the comments in the IEP, and the answer is yes. And from a practitioner standpoint, I think that is clear in this rule because this is a section of the IEP. So the IEP shall contain a section for parents to provide comments. So essentially what that means is the comments they provide will be in there. They will be in the IEP of record. Whether or not the district subsequently adds a service or a change or a program,
right.
That is the part that the LEA may but is not required to do that. Right. Because that preserves, an LEA has an obligation to offer what they believe is a FAPE, and so it preserves that. But the answer to the question of, is it clear that the comments are in the document? I think the answer is yes, because this is a new section and presumably will become part of the forms that it'll be added to the IEP form. So I do think that it's clear that it's in there.
Yeah. The second or the first sentence of this paragraph is the one that seems to set that up. Shall contain a section for parents. Yeah.
Thank you, Megan, because that's actually in our last meeting. I didn't go back to that first sentence. That is very, very helpful for me because I was struggling with the same, is it obvious? So thank you.
Right. So would you be comfortable with changing the parent shall be provided 10 days? Leaving out the words up to?
Yeah, I think that's what I think functionally we were saying they've got 10 days. So,
yeah, understood. Other comments or questions, please?
I had a couple of questions. And actually, if we can go in reverse order, I had 3 points that I just wanted to bring up. In 2363.7, which is on page 7, every time I see a list, with semicolons, there's a part of me that wants to know, is there an and or is there an or? And I think this is meant to be a comprehensive list. So my only suggestion there is that, at the beginning, it should say something like an IEP that contains information under one component need not repeat, blah, blah, blah. The IEP for each child with a disability shall include each of the following, just so that it's clear that, you need A and B and C and so on. So that's just a suggestion for clarity. My next question is with regard to 2362.2.5, which is at the bottom of page 3, continuing on to page 4. As I read subparagraph 2 on page 4, this is talking about documenting each of the following in scientific research-based interventions. And I may have missed it, but is there similar guidance for alternative-based, research-based procedures?
There's not.
No. Okay. And we're certainly not rule. There was discussion in this area, and please, Megan and Emily, correct me if I'm recalling this wrong. I believe this was the area where there had been an original suggestion, I think, from Jackie Kelleher of the agency to reference forms that would guide through some of the evaluation under different methods. And I think that in that form doesn't exist, and that is in fact more guidance probably than it is rule, and it's a tool versus a regulatory matter. The specific reference to forms and checklists that would guide this other research-based methods, it was consensus to remove that with the acknowledgement that there are tools that are available through the agency to support districts in this work. And if I'm getting any of that wrong, please, Emily or Megan, jump in.
I think you're correct, Kim. And the only other thing I would add is that the scientific research-based intervention, that's part of the federal language. So that's why that's there.
Okay. And then my last point that I was just going to make is basic skills on page 1. When I was reading through this, I kind of flagged it and said, is this defined? And it is defined on page 3. So just for someone, and maybe it was just me, but it might be helpful to reference that definition on page 1 and just say that it's as defined in whatever that subcategory is. And then there's also a little bit of a discrepancy between the basic skill areas listed on page 3 and where it ties back in on pages 4 and 5. The two groups are not completely identical to each other. And I didn't know if that was on purpose or if that's
intentional. They are two different lists. They have many elements in common, but they do different things in terms of how you do an evaluation.
Okay, thank you.
Mindful of the time, let me just, well, first of all, respecting what's been accomplished here, which is really significant. I think just plain exciting. You, Kim, and your committee have kind of leapfrogged the timeline. And I think you have essentially presented the report that is expected of you in March. And in March, we would, in the March meeting, we would vote what we would call provisional approval of the report and recommendations of the committee, with the expectation that there might be, what I mean anyway by provisional approval is that we're all on board with what you've got, plus or minus maybe a few little tinkerings, you know, and we talked about a few tiny tinkerings. And if the board is prepared, I would welcome a motion that the board accept the proposed amendments from this committee and vote provisional approval of them. The purpose of this, let me just clarify the process. I want us to vote provisional approval at one meeting and vote final approval at a subsequent meeting. It's a little bit like second and third reading in the legislature. You want to give everybody a chance to be sure that what we've just signed off on really is what we want. Because after we vote final approval, there are no more changes. It's done. It's going to become rule. So the idea here is every one of these committees needs to get a document that satisfies the board enough to be granted provisional approval. There may be a few small tinkerings to do that you would bring back next meeting, and we would vote final approval, and you're done. Imagine that. So we're at a situation where I think because of the work you've done, I'm working off the agenda for the March meeting, in which we say the SBE to indicate needed changes, if any, and I think we've indicated one or two tiny ones, and vote provisional approval. So is there a motion to vote provisional approval of the report as presented?
I'll make that motion.
Who made that motion?
Oh, Kathy was one.
Kathy, and second?
I just have a question, John, if we can actually vote since it wasn't warned for vote.
Yeah, we can.
Okay, then I'll second.
Especially because this is not a final vote. This is just saying you're really, really, really close, and we really like what you've done. The final vote will be warned, just to be sure. Who made the second on the motion?
I did, but if somebody else wants to, since I chaired the committee, that would be fine.
Kim, no, that's fine. That's fine. Yeah, no conflict. So it's been moved by Kathy Lavoie, seconded by Kim Gleason. Is there further discussion before we vote to provisionally approve this report?
I just wanted to make sure that Emily captured I think there were 2 or 3 amendments that were just raised, but I don't think had objection, but I think clarify.
So to be very clear, I have one, which is to strike the words up to that precede the words 10 days.
Okay. Yep. And then those that Jen suggested, I don't know if that's something, I couldn't tell in the context of the entirety if those are each.
Jennifer, are you satisfied with the document as it is in the areas that you questioned?
Yeah, I mean, I had a couple of questions that I feel satisfied with the responses. I mean, I would suggest that we reference the definition of basic skills on page 1. I can certainly be overruled on that, but I think if you reference the definition and say, you know, as defined in whatever the section is below, and then I think, you know, just again, to be crystal clear that, you know, when we're talking about the IEP, that it shows or includes the following, I think it would be helpful to say that it includes each of the following, or, you know, after every semicolon, it needs to be either an and or an or, because otherwise, I mean, I put myself in the shoes of a practitioner. I'm looking at a list. Do I need to comply with all of them, some of them? So anyway, I think that's incredibly picky, but I think it would be helpful as far as clarity.
Emily and Kim and Megan, are you all comfortable with incorporating the suggestions Jennifer just made?
I think that the language Jennifer asked for is here, where I've highlighted words. So no on that one. I would defer to Megan, but I've never heard that there's any confusion that each of the elements required to be in an IEP. Everyone understands that it's all of those elements. And I think that's reinforced by the fact that I've recently learned every LEA uses the form that's provided by the agency, which people call the Vermont IEP, and it includes every one of those elements.
Yeah, I would agree with what Emily said. From a practitioner standpoint, people are very familiar and comfortable with reading and interpreting these rules. And in fact, sometimes when things are repeated too often, it actually makes it more confusing. So for what that's worth, that's what I would say.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, so then I think you've added this reference to section F, subsection F below, I guess, and you'll add up to somewhere. Just also note that on the document, the H2 document, the complete rule set, you might update the members of the board.
We will.
I'm sure you will. So, board, any other questions or concerns before we vote to grant provisional approval to this document? Oh, I don't see any hands. All right, then. Are you ready for the question? So the motion before you then is to, together with the one or two suggestions that have been made and embraced by the team that's working on this, to vote provisional acceptance of this as it will become the board's final version. Let's take the roll, please.
Okay. Sabina Baroshu. And she may not be back yet. Yeah. Kim Gleason.
Yes.
Kathy Lavoie.
Yes.
William Mathis.
Bill, you're
Oliver
muted.
Olson.
Aye.
Oliver Olson.
Yes.
Peter Peltz.
Aye.
Jennifer Samuelson.
Aye.
Jenna O'Farrell.
Aye.
Chair Carroll, will you be voting?
I will be voting with enthusiasm and gratitude in the affirmative.
Thank you.
Now, members of your team, Kim and Emily and Megan and all of you, what we would, just to be clear, what we would expect at the next meeting, at the March meeting, is that we will give final approval of these changes to the 1300 and 2360 rules. And from that, we will then go to the Legislative Committee on Administrative Rules. So we're really in the home stretch of the rulemaking process. In order to be able to vote a final approval, we need to see the entirety of 1300 and the entirety of 2360 as modified. So in the case of 1300, because it's a new rule, there'll be no no striking through, it's all new. And in the case of 2360, there'll be some striking through and so on in the usual way. But that would be the board's final rule on 1300 and 2360 completely, okay? So that when we see that, we are then all signing off on that this will become a rule that goes into effect very soon after it's reviewed by LCOC. So you're really finally, about 2 years of very hard work, especially for you, Megan and Emily, is coming, getting very close to being done. I'm getting emotional, excuse me.
Oh, John. I just wanted to clarify, John, that the entire content of 1300 and 2360 was in the package.
I understand.
And it had been amended for these.
I understand.
But we will now make, we being Emily, and will make these last two changes. Yeah, exactly. And so we're just for the edification of the board to know that you are seeing almost the exact thing you'll be asked to approve at the next meeting.
Precisely.
And for the public, and I imagine these documents are up, so they'll have an ample opportunity. Thanks, Emily. Did I get your comments?
Yeah, so there won't have to be H1, 2, 3, and 4. There'll only be one document for 1300, and a separate document for 2360, and we'll sign off on it. Perfect. Nice work. You're ahead of schedule. Bless your hearts. Thank you. Let's move on to Megan and your report to us, which is, I think, in a very similar state of maturity and readiness on your work on both these 2220. Pardon me.
Right. Sure. So let me see if I am able to share my screen. Make sure I have the right thing up behind me first. So, yep, looks like I can. So it'll take a second to come up. A long second, so I'll give you the context. Because most of what I'm going to share today, the board has heard before in previous meetings based on overview, this will be relatively brief. And certainly, Emily, I think at one, yep, Mill is on here. I would encourage them to jump in if I am not highlighting something that is that I should be highlighting. But I am going to run through the changes made to the 2200 series minus the rate setting. That's the next conversation. And Suzanne, I am not seeing an option to share. My share tray doesn't open anything. So I can put it up, or I don't know, Emily, if you want to put it up and I can just speak to it, whatever the board would like. But unfortunately, it's not.
For what it's worth, the board did receive your marked up document. Yep. So board members should be able to follow along with that in case you can't put it up. That's fine. Great. Then I will do that. And again, I am zeroing in on the items of particular discussion of this group. So if I, in doing that, miss something, feel free, particularly you, Emily, because some of these changes occurred but weren't big discussion items. So I will start with down on page 2 of 15, so 2223.3, general conditions for approval. The changes here essentially backing up a step, and again, Emily gave this overview before, but this is about creating a distinction between independent schools who are approved and independent schools who are approved and can accept public dollars, because independent schools that are approved and can accept public dollars have the requirements to provide services for students on IEPs. So that change creates or outlines that distinction. If you continue down, and a lot of the underlined language here that looks new is actually just a moving around of language. Am I right, Emily? Which is why there's not a lot of discussion on that part. So now I am moving to page 8.
So section 2229, which is approval to receive public tuition, special ed approval. This is the place where we spent most of our time as a group discussing. In the first part about enrollment and requirements for independent schools, the language, it shall enroll any student with an individualized education program who requires special education services and who is placed in the approved independent school as an appropriate placement and least restrictive environment. That language is straight out of Act 173, and that really is the crux of the difference. 2229.2, staffing. An independent school is not required to demonstrate that it has the resources to serve every category in order to be approved. So that is not a requirement for approval. Further down, it will talk about the process a school will take in working with the LEA to get the services they need to provide for a student, but they don't, for example, need to have an on-staffed speech pathologist in order to get approved. If later they receive a student who needs that service, they need to be able to provide that. So page 9, this is 2229.3, assurances. And this is what an approved independent school will have to demonstrate. And it essentially means that they have the ability to provide basic special education services, that they understand special education regulations, that they will implement the IEP, and collaborate with the LEA around that whole process. In the next section, 2229.4, which is the procedures for enrollment, this is where the group discussed how it would work for an approved independent school and an LEA to work together around the enrollment process. Enrolling a student means that the school offers a position in the school to a student, provided that the provisions related to LEA responsibilities are met and the student meets the other requirements of a school enrollment policy. And the language here are really all about the procedures that the school and the LEA will go through when they're faced with a situation where the independent school does not have the services in order to meet that student's needs, and how they will collaborate with the LEA to create a plan to try to get those services. There's some timelines in here to be able to identify a solution if there's not agreement on whether or not the independent school can provide them. The LEA and the school will jointly contract with a hearing officer to conduct a hearing. And there's more detail here, but again, the gist of it is this is how they will interact with each other in the situation where the independent school does not have services. Let's see. The other section I highlighted that the group discussed is down on page 13. And that is about agreement as to costs. This is how an approved independent school will bill the LEA for services. So under C and D, the approved independent school may bill the responsible LEA for excess costs beyond those covered in tuition. And reimbursement of those costs shall be based on direct cost rates approved by the secretary for services actually provided. So this speaks to how the school will be able to bill the LEA, but also has to be clear about what they're billing using rates set by the secretary. And the last one is about showing documentation to the secretary about the reasonability of their rates. Those are the areas that I pulled out to highlight because that was the bulk of the discussion of the group. So again, Emily or I see Mila on here, he was part of this as well. If there's something in here that I did not highlight that I should have, feel free to add, but that's what I have.
Great job, Megan.
Thanks.
Emily or Mel, do you wish to comment?
I don't have anything additional to add.
Thank you. Board members, do you have comments or questions? Wow, you've dazzled us. I just have to mention that I continue to be, I think I talked about this last time, I continue to be very uncomfortable with this creation of something called an approved school, which is not eligible to receive public tuitions. That it describes perfectly what you have in mind, I understand, but it's such an awkward term, and it feels to me that it raises the question of somebody saying, well, I'm an approved school, and not finishing the sentence. And that's a gross misrepresentation of their status in terms of public dollars. I don't want to hold anything up with this, but I think I am going to ask the group, Oliver's group, to take a look at a better system of nomenclature for this. For example, at the moment, we have two kinds of schools.
It's 11:30.
Recognized schools and independent schools, approved independent schools or recognized schools. It seems to me you've added two new categories. One, that at least in our rules, one is what you call a therapeutic approved independent school. I would think you mean an approved independent therapeutic school or an approved therapeutic independent school. It's not, in other words, the approval is not therapeutic. So the language needs to be sharpened up a little bit. There's that category, which we, of course, need to distinguish. And then there's this new category of an approved where you can't send your kid on public money. I think this just raises for me the question of what's the difference between a school like that cannot accept public tuitions, but you can send your kid there, and a recognized school. I do not know the answer to that, and very probably they're not the same, but you'd have to ask, why would a school go through the whole process of approval if it doesn't get them the franchise to receive public dollars? A school can be in business in Vermont without being approved and receive tuition students anytime it wants, private pay to students. That's called a recognized school. So these are, in fairness to you, Megan, and your team, I'm not asking you to sort this out because it's actually a much bigger picture question about the nomenclature of 2220 and what statute says, not just with regard to approved independent schools, but with regard to so-called recognized schools. Jenna O'Farrell, you had some comments or questions.
I guess my thought, John, is if you're approved independent school that can't take public funds, it's probably because you're not taking or allowing special ed kids.
Right, that's precisely the reason.
And then you'd be a private school, right? Like that's a true private school where
we
parents
don't actually use the term private school in Vermont.
I know, that's what I'm asking. Would that be?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Would that be a private school?
Yeah.
I don't know.
And I hope Oliver and Kim and Jennifer are all noodling on this because I'm going to dump this in your lap. I don't want to hold up the good work you've done, but they will have an opportunity to tinker with this, and you'll get a chance to see what they come up with, Megan, because there comes a time when the three streams of work, your work, Megan, your work, Oliver, and your work, Emily and Mill, comes together and gets knitted into a single document. That has to happen fairly soon, by the way. So you'll all get a chance to see the others' work, and the board won't approve something unless everybody's on board with it. That's otherwise, other than this kind of awkward nomenclature, it looks to me like you've done a great job. Emily.
Yes, and respectfully to the board, I am the draftsperson of every document you're looking at today. So it is, it is all being unified in my inbox and my Microsoft Word before it gets to the board, which I think is a good thing. It's helping bring cohesion to the process that I'm in all of these conversations, and that is ultimately the board's decision. So remember, and this is to defend Oliver's committee a little, remember that the nomenclature is enacted in Act 173. and that several of us have discussed approaching the legislature to ask them to straighten up the nomenclature. As it stands now, we have to be careful. The legislature, whether they intended to or not, has given an entitlement to approved independent schools to continue to use that designation, but not go forward to be eligible for public money.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. So that may kind of tie your hands, Oliver.
We did have some discussion about this issue in our committee, so yeah.
All right, well, thank you. That we can fix that with the legislature, I should think. In the big bill, if nowhere else, it should be pretty easy. So with that, I want to point out that Megan and her team have gotten themselves to exactly the same position that Kim and her team leapfrogged to today, which is to say that our plan for today's meeting is to vote provisional approval of the recommendations of the advisory group with regard to 2220, meaning that at the next meeting we would vote final approval, and you, Megan, would be done for a while anyway until everything comes back. So is there a motion to for the board to vote provisional approval for the report and recommendations of the advisory group with regard to 2220?
I'll move.
That was Jennifer Samuelson made the motion. Is there a second?
I'll second. This is Oliver Olson.
Oliver Olson has seconded. It's been moved and seconded that the board will vote provisional approval and acceptance of the draft as presented to us today. And to my knowledge, there are no suggestions about modification other than the chair's crazy thoughts about nomenclature, which you can disregard. Are you ready for that question? So the question is, shall the board vote provisional approval of the recommendation of the advisory group with regard to 2220 rules? Will you read the roll, please, Suzanne?
Yes. I see that Sabina's not yet on the call.
Yep.
So Kim Gleason.
Yes.
Kathy Lavoie.
Yes.
William Mathis.
Yes.
Oliver Olson.
Yes.
Peter Peltz.
Aye.
Jennifer Samuelson.
Aye.
Jenna O'Farrell.
Yes.
Chair Carroll, will you be voting?
Yes, again, with enthusiasm and gratitude to the advisory group for, you guys have been at it for almost 2 years now, something like that. It's coming home. So thank you very much. Yes. So you have voted to provisionally accept. We will see this this part of the 2220 changes next meeting, at which we will vote final acceptance, and that will sit on the sidelines along with Kim's work until Emily's work on rate setting gets caught up. We give provisional approval of that, and then there's this merger where all three come together. Already, as Emily said, coming together in her word processing in her own mind. Very good. We're way off kilter, but let's keep plowing ahead. Amanda Garces, I think you're on board, and your colleague. We're running behind schedule. Just bear with us here, and we'll see how caught up we can get. It is possible that we may have to ask you to come back at the March meeting. I'm sorry to say that, but we are struggling to get caught up here. And of course, Amanda, we want very much to make sure we have our time with you this afternoon. So next item is where are we at? K, which is the business of the rate setting. And Emily, you're chairing that group, I understand, and where do things stand?
Thank you. So that group is made up of the same groups that made the first draft of the rules you just provisionally approved. So that work began over the summer. I think our first meeting was in July. That group proposed all the changes you just voted on to the full Act 173 advisory group, except for rate setting, and then said, okay, now let's dig in on rate setting. So we have met twice. At our next meeting, the Independent Schools Association, Millmore specifically, will present written markup to the agency's proposal. You are not seeing our working draft today for that reason. It's just the agency's proposal. We've had discussions so that I could explain why I chose the words that I did, but a key stakeholder group has not yet had a chance to give us their response. So it's just half of an idea right now. I believe after we all digest Visa's written response, we will be 1 or 2 steps away from the final draft. We're all hoping that'll be a consensus draft, but if we need to give the board 2 competing visions, we at least will know what those 2 visions are by our next meeting. So I feel that we're on track. I can show the board the text of the rule. It is one rule, Rule 2228, that we're amending. If you want to start looking at where it stands now, it has some conforming changes to it in the draft that you just approved. Where we're working is a concept of how much documentation and what documentation should the agency look at in terms of a therapeutic school's budget line items. And on what basis should the agency evaluate whether those line items are reasonable in relation to the services that are provided to publicly placed students? So it's a very financially heavy, it's an accounting sort of rule that we're writing.
I don't think it would be productive to put it up on the screen at this point, since we haven't seen it, haven't had a chance to study it. I would like to just call your attention to the schedule that we're on and that we need to stay with. And the thought is that at the April meeting, we would vote provisional approval of the rate setting work. In other words, you would have come to us in April with a fully integrated consensus agreement with regard to rate setting, meaning that you obviously need to come to us with something really getting there, or at least a side-by-side that invites the board to pick and choose in March. So is that something that we can count on you to produce?
We will abide by the timeline. I also want to acknowledge that Millmore did present his memo. We included his memo in today's documents and not leave Mill out of this discussion.
Yes, we have Mill's memo. My urging is that memo needs to get into specific language ASAP so that you can begin to respond to it, and so that you all start to actually have a dialogue that gets specific. Mill, would you like to speak?
Yes, thank you, Chair Carroll. I hope everybody's had a chance to see that memo that I sent in last week outlining where we are now and our intentions as we're headed into the next meeting. Draft rules are circulating right now amongst the independent schools people. There are 5 of them working in our group. I think by the end of this week, we'll be at consensus and ready to meet again on the 23rd with Emily and her colleagues. Up until now, we have followed the agency's cues on when we should meet as a group. But as you've heard me say in the previous meeting, that doesn't seem to be meeting our needs. And we're going to take the initiative on scheduling future meetings if the agency doesn't pick up the pace to match what we think is appropriate. I want to just mention that in that memo I sent to you and in the work we're doing, there are 3 rate setting requirements that are on our mind, broadly speaking, and they are consistency, transparency, and accountability. And based on the experiences of several schools in recent years, especially with those appealing rate decisions, we think that each of those 3 needs substantially increased emphasis. Consistency, by that we mean that for a given set of inputs, schools can expect a consistent response, a consistent rate response, consistent from one school to the next and consistent year upon year. Being consistent means establishing and applying standards and procedures. And as far as we can tell, the agency has none right now. No standards, no procedures. Transparency means doing everything out in the open, publishing all the standards and procedures after establishing them, using reliable data, demonstrating that the standards and procedures are being followed, showing how the math works, and making clear how the judgments were made. And then finally, in accountability, we are looking for an explicit audit trail on every application so that when a result is questioned, there is no doubt about what data were used, what judgments were reached, and who is responsible for the result. Overcoming doubts about data quality, procedures, judgments, and responsibility has been a core problem in the past, especially with rate appeals. So we're hopeful that the agency is receptive to these changes, substantial changes. It seems to us that a government agency that is regulating and providing the resources essential to the well-being of a roughly 800 seriously disabled students attending 31 different schools, we think that a government agency that has that responsibility needs to be mindful of those things that I've just mentioned. So that's it. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll take questions if there are any.
Thank you, Mel Moore. Board members, do you have comments or questions to share with either Emily Simmons or Mel Moore? Oliver, is that your hand?
Yes, I was going to say, Mr. Chair, somebody on the phone, one of our guests is typing and it's creating a lot of distraction. And so I was hoping Suzanne could mute the non-participating participants.
Thank you. I did mute them, Oliver.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And by the way, just remember, if you need to step away from your screen, please turn your video off. Thank you. Very good. Emily, Mill, we thank you. We look forward to seeing lots of good work next meeting. Thank you. And now we are ready to receive a presentation from the state board, the board's own committee on changes to Act 2220 that are not mandated by 173, but we see the, if you will, the 2220 rule locomotive getting on the track soon, and we thought we would add a few cars of possible changes. Oliver.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. You should all have a copy of the draft. I won't pull it up on the screen because I want to go through and provide an overview to summarize the committee's work. So that is available online as part of this agenda item. So a little bit of history. So this committee was established by the board at our December 16th meeting. There were 3 members of the committee appointed. So Kim Gleason, Jen Samuelson, and myself. And what I think is really, what was really helpful about this particular committee is that the 3 of us come from different school districts, so bring different sort of experiences to the mix. So Kim Gleason is a member of a school board that operates public schools for all grades. Jen Samuelson chairs the board of a non-operating school district. And I'm the moderator of a school district that operates schools for some grades, but tuitions for others. So we had a pretty good mix on our committee. We've held 7 public meetings to date. And at the start, we reached out and invited folks we saw as key stakeholders and invited them to participate in this process, namely Jeff Francis from the Vermont Superintendents Association, Sue Siglowski from the Vermont School Boards Association, Mill Moore from the Vermont Independent Schools Association, and also invited the Council of Independent Schools to participate. As the chair stated, our mandate was to focus on the potential changes we might want to make that were not specifically mandated by Act 173. And we divided our work into 2 phases. So phase 1, we really wanted to look at what changes we could attach to the 173 train in a way with a narrow focus on potential changes that wouldn't be disruptive to the 173 rulemaking process. And then to have a second phase that would focus on more complex changes that might prove to be challenging to incorporate within the 173 process. So over the course of several meetings, the 3 of us as committee members were able to participate in all of those 7 meetings. The various stakeholders participated in some, but not all of our committee meetings. And to sum up where we've landed for phase 1, that's really what I want to present today. There are a number of changes that can be summarized as follows. So the first is we really tidied up the complaint process and clarified roles and responsibilities. We also moved away from what was really a binary approach to the disposition of complaints to one that's a bit more graduated. So we've introduced the concept of an initial investigation as well as a formal investigation. And the idea is that as things come into the agency, complaints, and they may not even come in the form of a complaint. There may be an issue that's brought to the agency's attention. There's sort of an initial investigation, something very informal to establish sort of what the nature of the issue is. And then a decision is made within the agency about whether the issue can be resolved through informal means or if it is something more serious. And ultimately, if it's deemed that it's something that requires more attention because it's more serious, that would result in a formal investigation with a process very similar to what we have in place today. But what we recognized in our committee discussion is that what we have today is an all or nothing approach. A complaint comes in and the only real sort of prescribed path forward is for the secretary to make a formal recommendation to revoke or suspend a license. There's no intermediary step at all. So we saw that we saw a real opportunity to improve that process. So in conjunction with that, we've authorized the secretary to place a school in a probationary status with the right of appeal for to the school to come to the State Board of Ed if they feel that probationary status is unwarranted or unfair. We still have the same process where the secretary brings their recommendation to suspend or revoke after there's a formal investigation has been completed. And we've established a register of complaints that will be a public record, which will include all complaints that result in the imposition of probation or some formal investigation. And this register will include sort of a summary of the general nature of the complaint and the action taken by the secretary. And then the final change that you'll see in this draft is a requirement that any independent school in Vermont that offers a boarding or residential program would need to be either licensed by DCF or NEASC accredited. So that's another change that we're looking to make to include for the board's consideration. So that's what we came up with for the phase 1 changes. We were asked to have our proposed changes ready for this meeting, and that's what we're bringing before this board. For our phase 2 work, which we'll address in subsequent committee meetings for consideration in a future rulemaking exercise, we're going to be looking at the approval standards that would apply to schools that are not otherwise accredited by NEASC and go through the process that's run by AOE for approval, and starting with a specific focus on governance issues. So that concludes my report. Happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Oliver. Board members, do you have questions or comments on what Oliver and his team have presented to us? Well, I do, if you don't mind.
Go for it.
I'm looking at the bottom of page 4, the new language concerning complaints. The way you have written it, the Secretary should conduct an investigation in the case of reports or complaints related to the approval standards. First of all, that essentially invites any reports or complaints that are not necessarily presented to the Secretary, because you've struck out to the Secretary. So how can the Secretary, it just doesn't quite work that the Secretary would be responsible for a complaint that's, let's say, aired in the newspaper, but was never presented to the Secretary. So I just wonder if by striking out to the Secretary, you've essentially invited all kinds of complaints and reports, which may be completely outside even the knowledge of the Secretary. Second, I would just observe that you are talking about reports or complaints related to the approval standards and laws. I would think what you mean is reports or complaints related to compliance with the approval standards or laws. The question is the school complying with those standards and laws? Not, do you have a complaint about the standards? And the way this is written is it is a complaint about the standards. So it's just a little sharpening up there might be helpful. And then finally, I tried to map out in my mind the sort of decision tree. The Secretary decides, is this minor? Can it be repaired or not in an informal process? So you describe what should be done if it can be repaired in an informal process. You don't describe what should happen if it cannot. The question is, she should first determine whether the matter can be resolved. And then second, confirm that corrective action is taken. But what if they determine that it can't be resolved in this informal way? I think you need to have an arrow pointing to the investigation process, if you will, because there's a sort of a fork in the road. And you know, the way you've written it is, if you come to the fork in the road, take it. But really, you need to, I think, point us in the direction of what happens if it cannot be managed in this informal process. Just a small thing, and a very, very small thing. I'm sure you'll catch on page 5, second paragraph. There's a missing word at the end of the paragraph called formal investigations. And then finally on page 7, the underlined section in 2227, where you say in order to be approved, operates any school that has a boarding program, enrolls boarding students, or operates a residential program shall be accredited, and so on. But then the last sentence says, this requirement does not apply to independent schools that enrolls only day students. That seems to me to be redundant. If you enroll, if you accept, if you have a boarding program or enroll students in residential treatment, you're not a day program. So it just seems, maybe you want to be doubly sure that this is clear, but it is, I think, redundant. Trivial, most of them.
Yeah. So I'm do want to respond to a couple of those points, if I may, and I'm going to invite our Emily, our drafts person, to keep me honest here and to also fill in some of the gaps. So on the last point, we did have some discussion, and I think the issue we were, if I recall, that we were trying to get at was that there could be situations where there's a student who is not sponsored by the school per se, but the example is a student on like a foreign exchange program or something. We want to be clear. So you could operate a day program, and there could be a foreign exchange student who's staying with a host family, but it's a day school. They're not a boarding. They don't have a formal boarding program. So we were trying to make sure, we were trying to be clear that we weren't bringing those schools into the mix. Excuse me, Emily, do I have that? Is my recall accurate there?
Right. So at the beginning of the paragraph, we call out for who it applies to: operating a boarding program, enrolling students as boarding students. You're exactly right that we identified a few examples where there might be confusion about which category the school falls into, and the last sentence should reassure any program that was confused that if they only enroll day students, this does not apply.
So are you saying that if they only enroll day students and some of those day students are staying with host families or something like that, they are still day students and it's not falling under the first sentence? Is that what you're saying?
Correct.
Yeah, you might like to clarify that even. I mean, it's a great distinction. I applaud your recognition of that case. Thank you. Any other responses?
Oh, sorry, go ahead, Kim.
I was just going to say on that point, so in the instances where the school is coordinating that home placement, they may in fact be a boarding program. The fact that the student is not boarding on their campus, they're taking boarding tuition and they're funneling that through to homestay. Right. In a situation where it's a day school and sort of an external exchange program, run internationally, is placing students there by virtue of their relationship, their oversight, their funding, that a student be in a home and then attending this day school, that's when it would not apply. So if the school is funneling the money and the person happens not to be staying on the campus, it is still a boarding responsibility. So I just wanted to make that distinction because we spent a considerable amount of time talking about it. Yeah, and if it's not clear in our language, then I think we want to make sure that it is. It seemed clear to us at the time, but I think when we meet again, we can probably just make sure that we're reflecting that.
Yeah, Kim, that would be great, because that I was thinking the exact same thing. Whose responsibility is it if a school is collecting dollars?
Right.
For that homestay, right?
Yeah.
And and in those cases, they're boarding schools.
Right. And that's why we say if they're running a boarding program, because we're very conscious when we were writing this rule that there are schools that have a boarding program with dorms, right? But there are also schools that running a boarding program that don't necessarily have dorm buildings, but have homestay arrangements, but they're collecting a higher sort of tuition and providing a stipend to those families.
Well, I hear these. This is very helpful. I see the sort of subtleties of the conversation you've had. I think that those distinctions don't come across to a lay reader, and you might consider somehow making reference to these two cases you've described, sort of school-sponsored homestays as opposed to privately arranged homestays, or whatever the terminology might be, because they seem to fall in different categories. I could imagine some confusion, but thank you for thinking this all through.
And then just to return to the fork in the road, that was another one where, and that was a few meetings ago, so my memory is definitely failing me a bit here, and I'm hoping Emily can come to the rescue. But I do recall we had quite a bit of discussion at this point, and we're sure that the other language in that section addressed that scenario where the secretary was unable to resolve something through informal means. The remaining language still enables and contemplates for the secretary taking further action. Emily, did you want to comment on that?
Right, it's the next sentence that responds to this concern, which is upon a determination that informal means are not appropriate to the violation, or if the matter has not been resolved informally, then it says the secretary either places the school on probation or uses the option that it says the secretary has, quote, at any time to convene a review team to conduct that formal investigation.
Okay, very good, thank you. Any other comments or questions? So you folks are on a slightly later schedule for your work, as you know, from the timeline, but it looks like you are on schedule, and we appreciate that. And so you will see in the timeline exactly what is expected of you at the March meeting. That's very good. So we've covered a lot of ground. I want to applaud Angelita and Sabina for hanging in there with us on this. This is dry as toast. I mean, it's important, but frankly, I can understand why you might be tempted to nod off or go someplace else. And I thank you both for being attentive and looking attentive. Thank you. Board members, we're done now with the rule work. Anila, are you nearby? Oh, I'm sorry, Amanda. Pardon me, Amanda. Amanda Garces, are you with us?
Yes, I am, and
okay.
I know that Mark has to leave in 10 minutes, so he has a meeting. Mark, are you here?
Amanda, I wonder, could I ask if we could do two things, or do this in two sets? You have two things to review with us. One is your annual report to the General Assembly, which essentially updates us on, I think, your presentation from August of last year. And then the second part is to introduce us to the rule changes that you are proposing with regard to the equity standards.
The EQS, yeah.
Could you do one or the other of those and do the other one at the next meeting?
Yes. Mark, are you here? Oh, maybe he left.
There he is. There he is. Mark, you need to unmute. Mark, we can't hear you. You need to unmute. Still can't hear you.
Okay. Well, I can. Yes, I can do a quick one today since Mark. I really wanted to have Mark in here to. We had a plan to.
He's trying to reach you on the phone or something. I'm not sure. I can see him, but he knows he needs to unmute, but he can't seem to do it.
Okay. So I'll just go over quickly. Just a quick report. So I'm really, thank you so much for having me here again. Again, my name is Amanda Garces. I'm the chair of Act 1 Ethnic Studies and Social Equity Working Group. I'm here with my co-chair, vice chair, co-chair, Mark H. Hopefully he'll be able to come in. I know he has a meeting at 12:15, so he might not be able to stay long. So I'll make it as quick as I can. You guys receive our report and our recommended for changes in the education quality standards. So both reports are very it is very detailed. So I just want to go over some of the things first about the second report, some of the things that we're thinking about. And then I'm not going to go over the EQS today. I'm going to tell you why in this second. But some of the things that the Act One working group are working on right now is, or that we are thinking about, is the some explorations that we're doing. So we are speaking around the licensure and fieldwork requirements for future educators. That's something that has come up a lot in our committee. Also, we are looking at the adoption of policies on racial justice, social equity, and diversity hiring by school board. So we had a presentation by the School Board Association in our last meeting, and we are now starting to think about how we do this second piece of our work, which is to look at some of the policies, not only stable policies, but also policies by school districts. We are looking and thinking about evaluations of flexible pathways initiatives of 2013 in relation to serving historically marginalized students. So I just want to offer that some of the thinking that is happening and brewing in the working group. And then we began to establish and work through a professional development collaborative with the College of Ethnic Studies in San Francisco State. As you know, San Francisco State University, the Ethnic Studies Department is one of the oldest in the country. Most of their educators come from many of the communities that we are doing this work for, and are, are experts, national, international. They are working in schools and teachers. Many of them were part of the work that happened in California and for the curriculum that was a little bit under fire. And some of those things we are asking the legislature for support financially for 3 things. This year we are asking to help us. We're going to create a pilot program for 30 educators that are doing already this work in Vermont school to work towards an ethnic studies certificate that is a full credit class. So we are we're getting a second proposal now for to begin this summer with just online. We're also asking for some support to work some of these national experts to help us kind of go a little more deeply into the standards piece, which we have to report in June of next year. So that's what we will be doing. And so we're requesting funding, and we're requesting to add 3 additional members to our working group, 2 more students and then 1 Indigenous person, which it's a request that was made last year. So quickly, I just want to talk to you about, I talked to John this week around the rules and regulations and how rules are made. So what the report that you see this is some of the provisions, but we just met on Saturday as a working group, and we decided that we are not ready to open the Pandora box of these rules because we still have a few recommendations that we are working on, in particular around literacy, that we're thinking about that will be included in here. So that's why this piece of the work will be short today, because I don't want to go into detail because it has not been finalized. We didn't realize that the process was going to take 8 months, and that once you open it the soup to everybody. So we want to make sure that our report is very complete. So that is what I have. I don't know if Mark, if you are here.
If you can take that visual down, maybe we can see a little better. And that was excellent overview and very helpful to get us a little bit caught up to more recent developments with your working group. Board members, do you have any questions of Amanda?
I'm trying to stop sharing, sorry.
Okay. Very good.
I think I would just express appreciation for the work and seeing it in the context of all the pieces and having a sense of what might come under our responsibilities to help support the furtherance of this work. So that it's really great to see the big picture and then think about, again, where we are able to contribute or support advancing this work. So thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I think the most important part for us will be to really come up with a timeline for us to understand the process of the state board. Like, okay, like I didn't really realize that part, that once you made all the recommendations they needed to, because we do have another set of recommendations coming up in June. So like this was the beginning framework, the EQS, but we still have a bunch of other recommendations that we're going to be making in different rules that are pertaining to our charge. So it will be really helpful for us to understand the whole process. And I, spend the whole week trying to understand all the rules and like the rulemaking and learning that. But so maybe John and I can have a crash course to make sure that that I know all the process.
I'm glad you got to sit in for a little bit on the board's discussions about some rules in the works right now. That's sort of what it looks like, or that's a piece of what it looks like. There's a terrific amount of work that led to these conversations today. You're really seeing just the tip of the iceberg when you see the board as a whole meeting on these things. It's been literally 2 years that the advisory group has been working together with stakeholders to get us to the work we're at now. So Amanda, you've been excellent. You've covered a lot of ground real fast, and we're grateful for that. So unless there are any further questions, are there any? Thank you, Amanda, very much for your patience with us. And we'll see you, at 2? 2, great. Yeah. We'll be ready for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
So board, we're at the end of our morning work, covered a lot of ground. We have lunchtime. 2 things. When you leave your desk or computer, please turn off your camera, not to mention your microphone. And then please do your very best to be back here at 12:45. We have sort of a bittersweet moment of saying farewell to 2 of our board colleagues. So 12:45 sharp, please. We'll see you then. Thank you. So let's get started then. We are at item N, in which we have something to say to our 2 board members whose terms are expiring, Peter Peltz and Bill Mathis. Let's start with the senior of the 2. I think you've been on the board for 10 years, Bill? Yep.
Yes, 10 years.
10 years. So Jenna, take it away.
Oh, Bill, I have this honor to author and read you your resolution of appreciation for your service today. Whereas Bill Mathis has served with distinction on the Vermont State Board of Education for the last 10 years, and whereas Bill has served as a member of numerous committees, including the Legislative Committee Chair, the Search Committee for the Secretary of Education, Strategic Planning Committee, Education Quality Review Subcommittee Chair, Rule Series 1300-2360 Committee, and State Board of Education Vice Chair. And whereas Bill has held positions of Managing Director and Senior Policy Advisor to the National Education Policy Center at the University of Colorado Boulder, and as the former Superintendent of Schools for the Rutland Northeast Supervisory Union in Brandon, Vermont. And whereas he represented the State Board of Education on the National Association of State Boards of Education, NASB, 2014 until August 2019. And whereas Bill harnessed his influence from the bully pulpit and was mindful of the impact of statewide policy on the daily lives of children in Vermont schools, their families, and communities. And whereas Bill has authored countless widely circulated columns and conducted high-level educational research on the topics of state funding systems, assessment, standards, school choice, and constitutional issues. And whereas his advocacy for educational equity in Vermont schools has never wavered. And whereas he has worked through marathon board sessions and continually kept the focus on the best interest of all Vermont's children. And whereas his historical reflection and applied expertise inspired us all to think critically and with a sense of urgency regarding the transformative possibilities. And now, therefore, be it resolved that the Vermont State Board of Education recognizes and applauds the service and commitment of Bill Mathis to the state of Vermont, and be it further resolved that the State Board recognizes him for his commitment to equity and excellence for all Vermont students, his exemplary work, leadership, guidance, and friendship established an exceptional standard for the State Board. And it's dated today, Bill, here in St. Johnsbury, Vermont, and it'll be sent your way.
Thank you, Jenna.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I would welcome a motion to adopt that resolution as a resolution of this board. Is there such a motion?
So moved.
It has been moved by Peter Peltz. It is seconded by Kimberly Gleason. All those in favor of the motion to adopt the resolution honoring Bill Mathis for his service to the board, raise your hand. Very nicely done. It's unanimous. And if Dan French could vote, he'd raise both hands, I'm sure. Very good. Thank you, Jenna, and thank you, Bill. Let us now move on to Kathy Lavoie. Kathy, can you turn your camera on? Let us hear from Kathy Lavoie with regard to our colleague Peter Peltz.
Vermont State Board of Education resolution of appreciation for Peter Peltz. Whereas Peter Peltz has served with distinction on the Vermont State Board of Education from 2015 to 2021, and whereas he previously served in the Vermont State Legislature for 8 years on House Committee on Education, with 2 of those years as vice chair and 2 years as ranking member, and whereas he was respected as a measured legislative leader in his mission to improve education for all children, encourage smart economic development policies, and promote affordable health care for all, believing what's good for one is good for all. And whereas he has further served the people of his community as an elected official for over 30 years and a small business owner for more than 25 years. And whereas he engaged every action with an intense and deep focus on the welfare of Vermont children and families as his paramount guiding value. And whereas he was a strong advocate for the independent integrity of the State Board as a vital check and balance to democratic governance and as the most vital advocate for all of Vermont's children. And whereas Peter helped to guide the board through months of arduous and contentious hearings and meetings and to promulgation of the state plan mandated by Act 46, now therefore be it resolved that the Vermont State Board of Education recognizes and applauds the service and commitment of Peter Peltz to the state of Vermont, and be it further resolved that his colleagues of the State Board of Education, past and present, join this day in honor, admiration, and appreciation for Peter Peltz and his service and leadership of the board. Dated today in Barry and signed by your chair.
Thank you very much, Kathy. So would there be a motion?
So moved.
It has been moved and will be seconded by Jenna O'Farrell that the board adopt this resolution in honor of Peter Peltz and his service to this board and to the state. Are you ready for that question? If you are, raise your hand. Thank you very much. It's unanimous. Thank you, Peter. Maybe we have about 4 minutes for each of you. So let's start with you, Bill, as the senior member of us all, at least in terms of service. Would you like to give us some parting wisdoms?
Oh, parting wisdom in 4 minutes. Well, I'll do my best. Thomas Jefferson really said it. And he said, if a man wants to be ignorant and free, he wants what never was and never will be. And that really sums it up. And going on from there, when we went into universal education, the whole thing was the purpose of education is to have a democratic equity, and that's very, very important to me. And I'm very much worried about our society and what has happened with it that we've seen recently, which threatens democracy, which threatens the integrity of what we've got. And so education becomes very key for having that from taking place. And so I urge you above all matters is to pay attention to equity, equality, a real legitimate opportunity for all children, not gussied up in words, but made a reality. It's the most important thing we can do and for the direction of society. The 6-year tenure term was a very intentional thing. It was to make education a little bit apart from politics, but not completely. But I really appreciate that almost for the most part, but I won't say all, is that we've been very depoliticized, if you will, but I do urge that we pay attention to what happens in schools and in classrooms. We get caught up too much in playing trial and jury and so forth, but let's try to do something important in your time on the state board, and that's my wish and prayer for all of you. And thank you very much for your company and your friendship.
Bill, thank you. That was lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Peter.
Yeah, I really like to. I've been here in Vermont for 52 years. I came up when the wave of the 60s and 70s. And as Dorothy Canfield Fisher has commented, that there's been a lot of turnover in population, and each time it does happen, it sort of re-strengthens who we are as Vermonters and how we act as citizens. Before very long, when I moved up and I built our own house, and I got immediately engaged in town office. I was a lister, started as a lister, went on to the elementary board, chaired that, went on to the regional high school in Hardwick, chaired that, went on to the RAB board at Greenmount Technology and Career Center. You know, Vermont, it really does invite engagement, and it enriches us as citizens, and as it does the communities we live in. And you know, I came from Massachusetts, and that was not the case. Kind of a real story. When I first bought the land, and I was up here, I had been cutting in the woods, and I went down to our local store, you know, and nobody really knew me. And they started talking to me because they saw these chips all over me, and you know that I had been working. The converse happened in Sandwich, where I grew up, my father's barn, and they all gave me kind of the ugly eye, and because I wasn't up to you know, social standards, supposedly. But anyway, what I'm talking about is really what it is to be here in Vermont, and it has welcomed us, and it is it has really encouraged engagement. My son is doing that. My daughter-in-law is now going to be on the regional elementary board, and they've moved into our house, and I built a new house. And you may not know, you probably do, that I've been battling stage 4 cancer for over 2.5 years. And that has not stymied I think I've only missed 2 meetings, once after having taken chemo, which really knocked the stuffing out of me. I went down to the Bahamas for a rest. And then the second time was when I had a significant setback, and I'm battling that now. So the board, I wanted to be on the board after being on the Ed committee, because I really felt the value and the worthiness of the board. And it has really, to me, this current board and how it's been recently, everybody has a real background in education. I didn't really have that. I just sort of got it through hard knocks. And but this board is, I think, a terrific board, and I think it's a statement to our commitment to education and to Governor Scott and his appointees. So I just want to thank you all, wish you luck, and it's an ongoing battle, but it is certainly worth every minute and every ounce of strength that we can apply to it. So thank you all, and I hope to be hearing from you and what you're doing in the future.
Thank you very much, Peter. And thank you, both of you, for your service and your companionship and your friendship. We're very grateful to you, and we will really miss you.
And
yes, Oliver.
I just want to thank Jenna and Kathy for leading those wonderful tributes. Michael Chernick couldn't have done it better.
Nicely done. Thank you. Thank you. Well done. So with that, board, we are ready to transition to executive session. Before the motion is presented to go into executive session, I just will note that 3 board members will be recused from the meeting by prior understanding: Kathy Lavoie, Bill Mathis, and of course, Secretary French. After we have approved the motion, you will then leave this meeting. Don't shut it down, just leave it and go to the meeting link for which was sent to you about 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago by Suzanne. You'll find that link. You should find it probably in your calendar, and you click on that link. That will take you to a new meeting where we will reside together with our attorney, Bridget Acey, for about 30 to 40 minutes. So, Jennifer, do you have a motion?
Yes, in fact, I have 2. So first, I move that the board find that premature general public knowledge of confidential attorney-client communications made for the purpose of providing professional legal services to the body with respect to pending quasi-judicial proceedings would clearly place the board at a substantial disadvantage.
You've heard the motion. Is there a second?
I'll second.
It has been seconded by Oliver Olson. Suzanne, would you read the roll?
Yes, I will. Sabina Brochu.
Aye.
Kim Gleason.
Aye.
Kathy Lavoie.
Aye.
Bill Mathis.
Abstain.
Oliver Olson.
Yes.
Peter Peltz.
Aye.
Jennifer Samuelson.
Aye.
Jenna O'Farrell.
Aye.
Chair Carroll, will you be voting?
Yes, in the affirmative. So it is unanimous. And now, thank you. We have a second motion that's required to make this transition.
Thank
Jennifer?
you. Yes, I move that the board enter executive session for confidential attorney-client communications made for the purpose of providing professional legal services to the body with respect to pending quasi-judicial proceedings pursuant to 1 VSA section 313, subparagraph A1F, and to enter deliberative session to consider issues relating to pending quasi-judicial proceedings.
Is there a second?
Second.
I second it.
And seconded by Jenna O'Farrell. And is there discussion? Please read the roll, Suzanne.
Sabina Brochu.
Aye.
Kim Gleason.
Yes.
Kathy Lavoie.
Yes.
William Mathis.
Abstain.
Oliver Olson.
Yes.
Peter Peltz.
Aye.
Jennifer Samuelson.
Aye.
Jenna O'Farrell.
Aye.
Chair Carroll, will you be voting?
In the affirmative, thank you. Now then, before you leave, members who are not joining the meeting, I believe we will get back at a slightly different time than the calendar the agenda indicates. We're leaving at about 1:05, and I think we will be back between 1:35 and 1:45 at the latest, probably closer to 1:35. So we hope you will be able to rejoin us at that time. So those members who are joining the meeting, You can leave this meeting. You don't have to delete it or anything. And go to your calendar, and you should find in it the link to the executive session meeting. Thank you. Jennifer, are you on board?
Yes.
Jennifer, would you please introduce the motion?
Sure. Mr. Chair, I move that the board grant the request of the appellants in the Buckley, Valente, and Gallo appeals to have their counsel present oral argument to the board, with oral argument limited to 30 minutes combined for the presentation of the appellant's counsel and 30 minutes combined for the presentation of the respondent school district's counsel.
Thank you, Jennifer. Is there a second to this motion?
Second.
It's been seconded by Oliver Olson, moved by Jennifer. Samuelson, is there discussion? Then Suzanne?
Yes, John.
Would you please call the roll?
Yes.
In reverse order, if you wouldn't mind, Suzanne.
Start with the chair.
No, alphabetically in reverse alphabetical order.
That would be, I'll go ahead if you like. Aye, yes.
Okay, and Jenna O'Farrell?
Aye.
Jennifer Samuelson?
Aye.
Peter Peltz?
Aye.
Oliver Olson?
Yes.
Bill Mathis? Looks like he's not here. Kathy Lavoie?
Abstain.
Abstain. Kim Gleason?
Yes.
And Sabina Brochu.
Aye. Thank you, Oliver.
Isn't that nice, Sabina? Very good. Thank you all for that. We're okay. We're at the point. Let me make sure. Oh yeah, it's time for a break. On the plan is a question of the agenda for next coming weeks and meetings. I can just tell you that for the next 3 March, April, May, for sure, there'll be large hunks of our time devoted to rulemaking. I will just mention to you that there is one unified union school district that is talking among itself and may have some votes on town meeting day about withdrawal. But it's a rather special case, or it's a case different than Halifax and Reading in the sense that it is a district that was forced to merge. I mentioned to you this morning there's legislation that would sort of exempt those districts, but at the moment there does not seem to be any path for them to withdraw because they did not vote to merge. And there are a few other things that may are likely to arise, but nothing significant. So that's what the 17 March meeting looks like, is kind of a lot like today, at least as far as this morning's work goes. Probably very likely to be an executive session to continue discussions with our attorney in connection with the 828 appeals. Any questions or concerns about upcoming agendas? Yes, Kim? Can't hear you, Kim.
I'm sorry, no question or concern. Just a reminder that I would love for us to revisit our strategic plan, which is outdated, and think about perhaps even for summer retreat work, how we bring that back into compliance with our requirements and take a look at our future few years.
I grant you that it is something that has rather slipped through the cracks. There's an expression from management that the routine drives out the non-routine. That's why strategic plans are always left to last. They're sort of like wills, you know. Very good. Then let us take, you have, I think, 10 minutes to stretch, and then please be back here at 2 o'clock sharp for part 2 of our implicit bias training with Amanda Garces. Thank you. All right, let us get started. I think we have all that can be here. So we're about to go into the second 2-hour training with Amanda Garces, who is our trainer in implicit bias training. We have, this is a message to the watching or listening public. The board has completed its work agenda for this day. I must say we've covered a lot of ground. And so now the board is leaving its working session and going into a training session. So at this point, we will ask that the RETN video be brought to an end. We thank you, those who have been watching us. We thank you for being with us. We will be back in a month.